Hello, good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. And welcome to this panel discussion session of the GYSS 2022. My name is Choi Heng. I'm from the National University of Singapore, and I will be moderating the flow of this session's discussions. The organizers have set a very challenging and possibly provocative topic for us, unmet challenges in physics. It is fair to say that the diversity in research interests among the participants is great, and all of you must have some research agenda that you have set up for yourself in order to establish your standing as a member of the scientific community. You will have in mind some of the challenges that you would like to tackle, but you might want to hear about the insights from our panel speakers as to what they think might be bigger issues and bigger challenges, and hopefully with the reaction of, why didn't I think of that? Now, even our focus today is on the unmet challenges in physics. Those of you who are not in physics could perhaps also benefit from hearing about the tough nuts in physics and think about what your research focus could help in meeting these challenges. And in these days of international and interdisciplinary cooperation, such an outcome could be very beneficial. We will be calling for questions and comments from the participants, and you will have a chance to raise issues and to give your views on the topics that are going to be discussed in this session. Let me start off with some introduction of the panelists. Professor Takaaki Kajita is the Distinguished University Professor and the Director of the Institute for Cosmic Ray Research at the University of Tokyo. He received his PhD in 1986 and has been carrying out research at the Kamioka Observatory in central Japan using both the Kamiokande and Super Kamiokande detectors. The apical event happened in 1998 at the Neutrino International Conference held in Takayama, central Japan, when Professor Kajita announced the analysis results that provided strong evidence for atmospheric neutrino oscillations. In 2015, he shared the Nobel Prize in Physics for his role in this discovery. Currently, he is the leader of yet another project at the Kamioka Observatory, the KAGRA project on gravitational wave studies. Professor Kajita is also the president of the Science Council of Japan, which makes recommendations to the Japanese government as well as the general society about certain issues. Professor Didier currently holds appointments at the University of Cambridge, and I may not be up to date at this, and the University of Geneva. And he is also the Director Designate of the new Center for the Origin and Prevalence of Life at ETH Zurich. Now, Professor Gil was the first to discover a planet, 51 Pegasi b, orbiting a sun-like star outside of our solar system, shedding light on planetary systems and giving our scientists a new means to better understand the origins of life. In 2019, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics, along with two other scientists, for his seminal discovery. Now, although 51 Pegasi b is uninhabitable, at least to humans, due to its very high surface temperature of about 1,000 degrees Celsius, its announcement in 1995 sparked a race to find other exoplanets. Well, over 4,000 of them have been found since, and many of them by Professor Gilo himself, with an incredible variety in sizes, forms, and orbits. Ever since the award of the Nobel Prize, Professor Gilo has also been bombarded with questions about life in the universe. Professor Artur Ekert is the Lee Kong Chian Centennial Professor at the National University of Singapore, as well as the founding director of the Center for Quantum Technologies, or CQT, which is Singapore NRF's first research center of excellence. He's also professor of quantum physics at the Mathematical Institute of the University of Oxford. Now, he's one of the co-inventors of quantum cryptography, and his current research extends over most aspects of information processing in quantum mechanical systems. He has worked with and advised several companies and government agencies over the years. He is the recipient of several awards, the 1995 Maxwell Medal and Prize by the Institute of Physics, the 2007 Royal Society Hughes Medal, and the 2019 Mises Quantum Prize. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 2016. And in his non-academic life, he's an avid scuba diver and pilot. It is interesting to note that these three panelists have something in common. Each of them received the prize in recognition of their achievements that was also awarded to their PhD supervisors. Professor Kajita did his thesis research under Professor Masatoshi Koshiba, the 2002 Nobel laureate in physics. Professor Queloz shared the 2019 Nobel Prize with his PhD supervisor, Professor Michel Mayor. Professor Ekert and his thesis supervisor, Professor David Deutsch, both received the Mises Quantum Prize. Well, there's nothing like a mentor or role model that can excite the passion and sustain the resolve, as well as forging ahead in one's path to scientific discovery. Well, next we will start off the discussion and invite the panelists to share with us, perhaps in a few moments, of their thoughts and on the kinds of challenges, either in their current research area or in a broader context within which their current research initiatives are embedded, or in physics in general, challenges that deserve serious attention and the youthful enthusiasm and passion of our scientists present today. Well, first, I'm intrigued to know that Professor Kajita actually switched his research direction from neutrino physics to gravitational wave studies even before he received his Nobel Prize for his work on neutrinos. In a sense, he probably has multiple perspectives of challenges for scientists in these fields. So, Professor Kajita, can we have your comments and thoughts, please?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, certainly, I changed my research topic from neutrino studies to gravitational waves. Well, that was around 2008. And in fact, before this change, I worked in neutrino physics for more than 20 years. And I thought that was a little bit too long. So I wanted to do something new. And therefore, I decided to do gravitational waves. Anyway, I'm a cosmic ray physicist. And if we look at the universe, there are many very important unmet challenges. For example, we do not know what are dark matter particles. We are sure that there are dark matter particles in the universe, but we do not know what are they. So, for example, this is really a very important issue for us to understand the universe. What shall I do? Shall I continue or ask some other speakers to say a few words?
Well, if you have something more to say about this or raise some, challenges to our participants, you can do that now, or you can do that later.
Well, okay. Well, then maybe just one more word.
Okay.
I said I worked in neutrino physics, and in fact, in neutrino physics, well, certainly we understand a lot in the last, say, half a century or so. However, we still have a fundamental question about neutrino. We do not know if the neutrinos are Majorana particles or not. This is really an extremely important question, and we have to know within a reasonable time scale.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Kajita, for the opening remarks. Well, next we perhaps turn to Professor Queloz. Well, when ETH announced last year the establishment of the new Center on the Origin and Prevalence of Life, you actually tweeted, "The timing is perfect." And you welcome the chance to work with scientists in other fields, obviously, right? So what are your thoughts on the worthy challenges on this line of research on either exoplanets and the origins of life?
Well, thank you for the opportunity, I think, to explain a little bit. What I mean, I am into the field of finding planets, and the question of life is looming around and still there, and a lot of people asking questions. And I think it has been quite a difficult topic where little progress has been made, and for the simple reason that, I mean, science is based on data and facts, and we were essentially missing all these facts and all these data. You can have theories, and there are theories about that, but the practicality is difficult. The main reason is life on Earth. I think if you look for the beginning of life on Earth, I mean, there is nothing left. I think all the geophysical traces and mineral traces of life that would be from the first billion years is completely vanished and erased by the nature of the recycling you have on Earth. And now what is happening is actually there is a bit of a change on all of this. So first one, we have plenty of planets right now, and we're finding more and more planets, and we're detecting atmosphere on this planet, and we're studying the diversity of the planetary, structure, planetary atmosphere. And the question is whether there are ongoing life on this planet. We keep coming and keep coming and keep coming, and we want to say something about that. The other reason, I think space has made tremendous progresses, and now we're launching rockets on a daily basis. We're exploring Mars, we will explore Venus, we'll go to the satellite of the giant planet. And we are really in a situation where we can try to probe for life in the solar system, but outside the Earth. And that's a fascinating question. It's the idea that we are now getting sample for Mars, and tomorrow, maybe in 10 years, we're going to bring this sample back on Earth. We will be studying this sample with great detail, looking for isotope deviation, something that may be telling us some interesting chemistry related to life is happening, and has happened at least in the past on the first billion years. And then what is going on? It's in the labs. I mean, the chemistry. The chemistry is living a full revolution right now. I think that the technology used in the chemistry, the equipment they're using to analyze, very, very complex. I mean, it's fascinating. You can give something to a chemist, and they're going to give you the detail what it is right now. It was not possible 20 years ago. And that has been so much progress on that front, in addition to the progress being made on what we call computation chemistry. So we can compute chemistry into computers. So you could do chemistry not in real, but you can do computers chemistry. And the computer becoming more and more powerful. There's more and more potential here. And tomorrow you can really explore millions of combinations of chemistry in a couple of minutes. And I would have taken, years of chemist work to be done. So all this together is unique. And I think we are now in a situation where we can seriously start making progress on the questions of, first, the origin of life on Earth, the way we understand it, and the question is possible life elsewhere, and the connection with life on the planet. And this is happening now, and it's the reason why we are establishing these centers. I'm not the only one. It's happening in Harvard, it's happening in Chicago, it's this discussion in Caltech about doing the same. So there is a similar center being built up in Munich. So there's a couple of centers, and this center have a very simple goal. We have to break apart the old-fashioned structure of science. We cannot keep working with the physicist in one corner, the chemist in another one, the geophysicist in another one, and the mathematician here. We have to bring them together, and we have to bring bridges between these disciplines. And that's the big challenge, essentially, to me, of the physics of the future, is being able to be more flexible and trying to benefit from what is being learned by this other kind of way of working. And I have an anecdote to give you an idea how far we are. I made a paper recently with one of my colleagues doing biochemistry. So I brought some equipment, from astrophysical equipment, into a wet lab. And we did the paper. It was a great lot of fun. And the most fun part was the paper when we start discussing what to write in the paper. And I remember the point when I said, oh, but we need to put some error bar on your numbers. And he looked at me, I say, we don't do that in chemistry. So to give you an idea, I think how much the culture is different and how much is fascinating and exciting to work into that. So that's what I'm doing right now.
Right. Thank you. I think in addition to the technical challenges, obviously the management and organization of research teams these days itself poses a strong challenge to the culture. Thank you very much. Before we get into any kind of questions, perhaps we can invite Professor Artur Ekert. Artur, over the years, you have steered CQT onto the world map of quantum information science. And the works done at CQT are gathering international respect and recognition. What are your thoughts on the remaining and perhaps even emerging challenges that need to be addressed in the years to come?
Well, thank you, Choi, Heng, and thank you for having me for this discussion. In a way, my answer is a follow-up to what my predecessor actually said. So I think working in quantum information science or working in the field where you're trying to look at information from the physicist's perspective, right? So you realize that information is physical and what you can do about information depends on the underlying laws of physics rather than mathematical statement. So it's kind of amazing that historically we have a theory of information that is, many people think, purely mathematical, which it isn't. So the big challenge in this field was exactly the same. So you had a mathematician in one corner, you have a computer scientist in another, and you have a physicist, and you start learning from each other, right? So you try to explain to a computer scientist certain ideas about physics, about quantum physics, for example, and then you learn about computational complexity from computer scientists who have their own way to define complexity of processing of information. Then you talk to a logician about the nature of mathematical truth, and you put physics into this. So it's kind of interesting to see that, you know, we created a certain silos, right? So historically, universities have Department of Physics, Department of Mathematics, here's the biology, but nature doesn't know about those divisions. So there's lots of interesting stuff to learn in between them, and I think that's a big challenge. The challenge is also to educate people to be able to do it, because each discipline develops sort of its own language, right? And people use this language. And somehow you have to also come up with a set of tools that allow you to work across different disciplines. So I think for me, I think that's quite a challenge to both to, you know, carry on and do research in this field, but also develop a set of tools and methods that would that then you can just pass to students and to the next generation that can explore it. So I think, to me, the big challenge is to understand the nature of information, looking at it from the point of view of not only mathematical, but what it really is, how you can process it, looking at it from you know, assuming that it is physical, looking at it from more like a physicist's point of view. Even though, you know, even now I'm sort of like a slave to this language, right? Because I'm saying physicist, a mathematician, a computer scientist, which is already not quite right. So at some point we have to develop more universal language.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think what we will now have some time to address some of the questions that have already been sent to us. Right? Obviously, the number of questions is likely to be large, and the time allocated to this particular session is limited. So I'm going to have to exercise my moderator prowess and prioritize them, and ask for your forgiveness if we are unable to get to your questions. Before the session, we had actually sent out a sort of a request for people to send in some of the questions. So we will start with some of these. Right? The first question, in fact, is, well, probably directed to Artur Ekert from Neelkant Gundu from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And the question is, when will quantum computing and communication become a mainstream technology for everyday use in our mobile phones and our laptops? Right. Obviously, when can I get one? From Amazon.com.
Yeah, well, there's a very simple answer to this question on my side. I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows about it. One thing that I should say, there's lots of hype at the moment about quantum computation. It's you keep reading about it, and some statements that you can hear are truly outrageous. It just, from the scientific point of view, the first thing you have to do is to really be more precise. What does it mean really to have a quantum computer? At which point a quantum device that you can control and do something about it becomes a computer? So now we are talking about few quantum logic gates that you can put together. We are talking about having very noisy quantum systems that you can control. And the challenge is, to what extent those noisy systems can do something interesting and useful for us. A fully fledged quantum computer that will have enormous computational power is probably, years away from us. I don't think we'll have one in 10, 20, even 30 years. But we can have useful devices in a not too distant future. So I would say, I don't think you can just get a quantum computer or install a quantum app on your quantum iPhone in that will not happen in the next 20 years or so.
Okay. Well, okay. I will save up for that. Okay. Let us try to move on to the next question from Debobrata Rajat. This is a question actually on gravitational waves and is originally directed to Professor Queloz, but perhaps Professor Kajita, you can also chip in and comment. And the question is, how difficult is it to measure a gravitational wave background present, and what are the implications if it is experimentally observed? Before we get into comments from the panelists, perhaps I can advertise that we're going to have the next question from, let me see, Disha Kapasia, and directed at Professor Kajita. So yes, how difficult is it to measure gravitational waves background, as well as, if it is measured, what implications does it make? Professor Queloz or Kajita? Professor Kajita?
Well, I think Professor Kajita should go ahead. I mean, he is working in this field since so long, so he has the whole expertise to answer better than me.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Well, certainly the gravitational wave background is extremely important. This is an extremely important item for us in the measurement of the universe. And if we observe this gravitational wave background, we understand that at the beginning of the universe, there was a special period called inflation. At that time, the universe expanded tremendously. So this measurement will be really important. And another question is how difficult it is to measure this background. Well, typically, people would like to observe gravitational wave background by precisely measuring the polarization of the cosmic microwave background. And it seems to be extremely difficult, but people think that this is not impossible. So we hope maybe within the next 20 years, we get some measurement of the gravitational wave background. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Professor Kajita. Professor Queloz, do you have anything to add? I think he's muted at the moment, right?
sorry for that. I think Professor Kajita is absolutely right. I think this is an amazing measurement, and the day is going to happen. We may have some surprises. I'm pretty sure, because there is something we have to admit. I think the cosmological model works very nicely, but we still have a couple of issues here and there, and we cannot reconcile with the microscopic size of the universe. So we don't match the two together. So we should be open for surprise here.
All right. Thank you. All right. Do we have Disha on the line? Okay, Disha, would you like to introduce yourself as well as ask the questions, please?
Hi, thank you so much for this exciting discussion. My question is to Professor Kajita. Both the projects you were associated with, previously the neutrino detection for neutrino oscillations and now currently gravitational waves, they are projects which are long-term in planning and to decades before their detection. So what was your motivation and challenges to continue in these two projects?
Well, thank you very much for this question. Well, certainly my motivation is to understand the universe, to understand nature, that's all. And we know that it takes time. But even if it takes time, we'd like to know the secret of the universe. That's the whole motivation.
And what are some of the main challenges that you found in your career?
My main challenge, or
yeah, like a part of the collaboration, because these projects are from a large collaboration. So of course there are like challenges that you need to discuss with everyone. So what were the challenges you faced?
Yeah, thank you very much. In fact, now I'm working in a gravitational wave project. This is called KAGRA, and this is an international collaboration, mainly from the Asian countries. And we have about 400 people. And of course, as a collaboration, we have to discuss. However, now the challenge is, during the last 2 years, we are unable to meet physically. I found, well, certainly nowadays we have technologies to discuss online. However, I realized that it is really important to have the face-to-face discussion physically. So at present, this is the biggest challenge for me.
Thank you so much, Professor. And thank you everyone for your insights.
Well, do the other panelists share the same sentiment about, face-to-face versus email and virtual meetings as one of the challenges in actually tackling some of the physics challenges?
Well, that's obvious. I think what we have learned during this pandemic situations is we should maybe pay more attention to the few face-to-face meeting. I think we also learned that we don't need maybe to do only face-to-face meeting. We can do quite a lot of the work remotely, but there is a balance that we need to strike here. And when we have face-to-face meeting, we should maybe value the quality of the meeting as well, with all the social element as well. And that was pretty obvious. I would say for the student, that's a very difficult time. And I see my students, they really have difficulty to cope with the situation because they need this. You were mentioning this mentoring element between the senior and the learning part of it. And this is really essential to the science. We need this real life contact and these interactions, informal interactions between the people. And I think these are the ones that are suffering the most of this situation. Hopefully we have learned for that, and we are seeing the end of it, and hopefully we just manage not this to happen again, ever.
Yeah, I exactly had the same sentiment on my side. I think there are many meetings that for which human interaction is really important, especially the brainstorming things where you just want to come up with new ideas, where there's not like a schema, a specified agenda to the meeting. Then it's much easier to do it face to face. But we also learned that there are many meetings that are absolutely, quite okay to deal with remotely.
Okay, that's selectively useful and not so useful meetings, virtual meetings. Thank you very much for your comments. There are a couple of questions that have shared a certain commonality, namely interdisciplinary science and particularly the approaches that are existing in each of your individual disciplines. So I will not call upon any one of these people who are asking the question, but let us sort of like have a chance to have the panelists comment on this before we call on, let me see, Panya Wood on the question is to be directed to Professor Queloz about the kind of devices that you're going to be sending into space. All right, so interdisciplinary collaboration and interdisciplinary communication, right? Do you see that as an obstacle in your research fields? Maybe we'll start
Okay,
with Artur.
maybe I can.
Oh,
yeah.
I see. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, please.
No, please, Artur, if you want to start. That's fine.
No, that's fine. Just please go ahead.
Well, yeah. Well, I think there is no limitation to what we're doing. It's just the limitation that we're setting to ourselves. So we should really be open-minded and trying to find out the best way to do what we have in mind. And that's my first comment. No, of course, we are living into a society with structures, with funding agencies, with a lot of regulations. So we have to play the game as well. And I think we have some responsibility when we're becoming at a stage when we have an impact on science because we have more seniority. We can really, direct a bit better what we're doing. To explain, and I'm spending a lot of time to explain to funding agencies, admin and director here, because some of them they don't understand. There is this micromanagement spirit that they keep having when they want to enforce framework, they want to enforce controlling, they want to enforce all this management skill that may be perfectly fine when you operate maybe a company that is moving people around, but it's not applicable to science. So I keep telling, let the science do the job and let them work peacefully and the way they like, which means breaking a lot of structure, which is very old-fashioned. And my main battle right now is on the peer review mechanism, which is, I think, not functioning the way it should be. I think if you keep asking the same people to peer review the same other people, you end the same result at the end. And you have very limited vision, and you never build up long vision. And it's difficult to expand beyond your usual field of competencies. And the fact you limit the boundaries most often of the applications, limit itself the growth and the possibility of the funding. And that's quite amazing to realize that most of this multidisciplinary exercise I'm doing are funded on private way. And this is foundations, and they operate in a different model. But when you go for state funding system, it's very difficult. And I'm battling on that aspect. But I think the peer review mechanism and the structure of the funding, I think if we can fix that, everything will follow, because I do believe the scientists are doing what they're doing because they're extremely curious, and nothing will stop a scientist to learn what they need to learn, even if it's not something they have learned in the past. And I think there have been people moving field. I think Professor Takaaki is a very good example that he started somewhere and he goes somewhere else. And I kept learning every time. So that's okay. The problem is the structure of the academic, I think the way the curriculum is being built on, and also the way the funding agency of functioning. And this is where we have to work, and we have to work hard and loud.
Okay, Professor Ekert or Professor Kajita, do you have anything to add?
Well, actually, the same. It's. I would just repeat the whole narrative.
Yeah. definitely, I think that is a sort of a trend that is becoming stronger and stronger. We probably can do a whole lot more if we were to have interdisciplinary teams that work together, I think, on a mega project like this. Okay, so I think there's a question by Panya Wood Tonanon. Is he on? Yes. Can you introduce yourself and ask your question, please?
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Panya Wood. I'm a Thai graduate student in NTU, Singapore. Luckily, I'm here. So my question, Professor Queloz, is that since we are sending the James Webb Telescope, and it's an instrument that is slightly different, because if I remember correctly, Hubble telescope focusing on visible light, and James Webb Space Telescope is focusing on IR, like IR region. So my question is that, can you give us a glimpse of what device we are sending next after this? And what information are we expecting to be getting from them, and how it can bring us closer to understanding how exoplanets and life in the universe works? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Well, when you want to study the universe, you want to have as much option that you can. So I think the big development right now is to grow the size of the collection area or the resolution, and also to expand all the wavelength, including some wavelength which is not wavelength in a sense because they're not electromagnetic but gravitational waves, which is also a way you can use to probe the universe. So we're doing in these directions. That's why we're building gravitational wave observatories and facilities. That's why we're building gigantic telescopes on the ground. And that's why we're planning to build the next generations of the next series of space telescopes. Now, infrared, there is a good reason why we go in the infrared. Well, if you want to look back in time in the universe, everything is moved to the red, and something that would be visible in the blue and even the UV and would be seen in infrared. So if you want to see very far in the universe, you have to look in infrared because of the red shift. That's a very simple reason. Now, a lot of exciting science is what we call the cold object in the universe. So you have a lot of cold objects, and one of them is the planets, for example. They're cold compared to stars and to other objects. So this is really why you want to go in the infrared. I mean, the Earth, the peak emission of the Earth is 20 microns. So if you want to go in this direction, that's why you want to infrared. So there will be more and more infrared. And that's a new technology. It's only a technology that has shown up in the 60s. And first, it was only military base. I know it's pretty easy to get an infrared detector these days. And this is why infrared, it's a fascinating wavelength. That's the reason why we want to push in this direction. But maybe we can hear something about the gravitational waves, because there will be, I think, gravitational waves telescopes. In a way, they are already, but that's a completely new way to see the universe. And I'm fascinated by this topic. This is so amazing.
Okay, Professor Kajita, would you have something to add?
Yes, thank you. Well, certainly, if we have new tools to measure the universe, we understand the universe better. And certainly, gravitational wave is really a completely new tool to understand the universe. And therefore, we expect a lot of exciting science ahead of us. And well, about the infrared, well, certainly infrared is for optical, but let me speak with an analogy. At present, the gravitational wave detectors on the ground are sensitive around the frequency of about, say, a few hundred hertz. Now, of course, if we want to look back the universe, we want to be sensitive to the lower frequency. However, we have a problem on the Earth. We cannot avoid the motion of the ground, which are typically bigger in the lower frequency. Therefore, people are thinking to launch a gravitational wave interferometer into this space. This way, maybe, say, in 10, 15 years, we could measure lower frequency gravitational waves. So we have, again, really exciting future.
Thank you. Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Okay. There are also a couple of questions which are directed at all three panelists members. It's about, my comment about you sharing the same prize with your PhD supervisors. All right, so we will do that, but later, next, after that, we will go to a question about the role of data in addressing the scientific challenges that these days. The question is from Srikulna Milnori, which says, understanding science is based on data nowadays. Actually, understanding science has always been dependent on the data. But in any way, let's try to address the question next. Right now, I think the question, common question from several participants is that, to what extent did you do you settle on your research interest because your supervisor says so, or did you sort of step onto something that on your own? Who would like to go first?
Okay.
Yes, Professor Kajita.
Well, thank you for this question. Well, it is true that I joined the Kamiokande experiment. Well, this experiment was initiated by Professor Koshiba, and well, certainly I was excited to hear the scientific goal of this experiment. Therefore, I joined. But during my studies using the Kamiokande data, I realized that the neutrinos are quite interesting. Therefore, at some point, after getting my PhD, I changed my research topic within the same experiment from the proton decay analysis, that was my previous analysis, to neutrino studies. So in this sense, my research depends partly on my thesis advisor, but partly this is my own.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Professor Professor Gill?
Yeah, happy to share my experience on that. Well, on the reason why they are quite often good student and good supervisor, I think my view is very simple. I think the good student are attracted by a good supervisor, by a good professor. So, and then the professor likes to be working with the good students. So of course, there is a selection effect and on that. And there is a lot of series when you see very good professors attracting students, becoming themselves, amazing professors, and they have good students. And there is what's called families like that you can trace back, which is not a surprise. This is how the system works. It's like a sport game. I mean, the best team attract the best players, and that's what it is. Now, in the term of whether what we're doing, is what being been told. Well, I would say just the opposite, because what makes the system working, in a very efficient way is it's the energy and the creativity and the spirit of the youth, which is meeting the experience at the same time. And that's a terrific, I think, mixing. In my case, I was not supposed at all to find a planet, but we did everything we could to enable a planet to be found, but of course nobody would have guessed there would be one. Well, it was a surprise, actually, and it was not part of my PhD, but when you work together the best you can and the best way, well, you find out many things that is a surprise. So it's not exactly that being told, it's being in the right surroundings, having all what you need to develop yourself and to unleash your creativity. Because it's about creativity, and that's pretty clear, and I see that every day. I mean, I love working with my PhDs, with my students, because they're bringing so much creativity and energy and ideas that I can have, and that's the way science works. We have to remember ourselves. I mean, the science we're doing is possible because of the science of our peers in the past, and we can trace back down to Galilei. If you're talking about the data, we're all a child and grandchild of this long series of scientists. So scientists really is kind of a family stories. So we have to give our knowledge to the young generations, and the young generation is giving me and giving us the energy and this creativity that they have, and they challenge what we're doing, which is good. So I tend to joke about that. I say when a PhD supervisor tell you what to do, I just do the opposite. I mean, you have more chance to get more creative if you believe this is what you have to do.
Thank you. That's good advice.
Well, I'll be careful with the advice.
Artur, would you have something to?
Yeah, well, I can only agree with that. I have to say that indeed, it's just like if you, well, at least in my particular case, I ended up in just being curious and walking around talking to people, trying to find the answer, and then I ended up talking to David Deutsch. I don't actually know whether he really wanted me as a student at all, whether he wanted any support at all. But I was persistent, and perseverance paid off. And then we started talking about interesting stuff. And then after that, we started writing papers and discussing things. But it's not just one person, Choi, Heng. It's just when you go through life, your scientific career, many people affect your thinking in a different way. Like on my path, I found you, for example, on my path when I came to Singapore. You were certainly a sort of inspiration for me how to in the Asian environment, to understand a little bit more Asian culture and how to work more effectively with my colleagues in Asia. Without that, it would be much more difficult to do anything at CQT. So okay, you meet, you have supervisors. Some of them choose you, you choose some of them. Sometimes it works, both ways. Sometimes it works one way. But actually, at the end of the day, it's about you and your choices, and try to realize that you are probably the average of 5 most interesting people you are surrounded with or you interact with. They shape you, and so choose them wisely.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your comments and advice. I think the supervisor graduate student relationship is, I think, getting more and more two-way traffic than before. I think I recall some of the stories about Enrico Fermi. Whenever a graduate student came up to him and say, I would like you to be my supervisor, he would take out a notebook from his drawer and say, this is a list of questions that I cannot solve. Pick one of them and do it. Then you can teach me something. So yes, I think on the one hand, a good supervisor could in principle provide you with the inspiration and maybe a little bit of guidance and advice coming from their experience. On the other hand, as some of our panel speakers raised, your imagination, your independence, your interaction with your other faculty members or graduate students could also have very immense impact on what you're going to develop. Okay, I think what we did not. Do we have an answer? Yes, question right in the line. Yes, please go ahead.
Hello.
I'm sorry. Before we go start this question, let me try to advertise the next one. I think we are going to be looking at a question that is something to do with data in modern science. Oh, I'm sorry, that has already been done. Sorry. So the question is coming from Zhang Zuocheng, who has something to do with quantum computation. I think, okay. Yes, please, go ahead, ask your question.
Yep. First of all, I would like to thank you for giving me this such a good opportunity to ask you all that. We know that to understand the science is based on the data that we collect, right? And how do we know which kind of the data that can explain the unmet problems or unmet challenge that we are going to solving?
Anyone from the panelists would like to volunteer some comments?
Maybe I can try something here, because there is something that I think which is hidden behind the question, which is very important, which is the way that science communicate what they're doing. So it's good to remember clearly that the science is driven and based on the data collections, whatever data you have in mind, and the difficulty that we are experiencing these days with the communications to the public at large and to the decision maker. I can think about, this global warming situation, so maybe in the COVID, explaining what they have to do, what needs to be done, is the intrinsic complexity of the data sometimes. It's not anymore the science of the 16th century when you could essentially see, you cannot do like Galileo doing the experiment and see things rolling into a ramp and this. It's not working like that. I think now we have clearly extremely complex equipment that is being used, and this disconnect the direct feeling, the direct perceptions, and this called a common sense. It's just irrelevant in this case. What is a common sense? When you look, I take this amazing equipment of my colleagues doing gravitational waves measurements. when you look at this, what is a common sense telling you? Nothing. This is just a piece of material somewhere, and it does nothing move. And what do you do? There's a lot of electronic stuff, and there's nothing you can learn about. So I think this is a real difficulty for science at large, and I think we should be more aware of that. And we may want to spend a bit more time in the communication aspect, because for most of the people, they just don't understand what we're doing. And they don't understand that most of what we're doing are rock solid based on data, even if these data are awkward, even if some of the data are coming from a telescope which is behind the moon. There is a real data, there's a real telescope, the real observation. But only thing you see is something like an electromagnetic signal you get on your computer. So the data connections, and that's what you said. How could you use the data to find things which is unknown? Actually, there is no problem with that, as far as you understand what means the data. And I think the problems right now is understanding what are these data. And the global warming is the best example. I think the global warming is known from the science since the 80s. It was clear-cut understood. There were no debate about what is the situations there. And then you have seen people arguing for 30 years on nothing, essentially, because they didn't understand the data. And you had this absolutely amazing remark from well-known, politician saying, "Oh, look, today it's very warm. So, sorry, today it's very cold. So what do you think about global warming? It's snowing today, so there is no global warming." So I think this common sense, which is the way we have, does not apply into science. And we should kill the common sense. It doesn't work in science. It's a rational thinking. And that's the big challenges. And I have no solution for that. I'm just aware that this is one of the biggest possible challenge, is communicating science, and becoming even more complicated because the equipment we're using is even more complicated, and will keep growing in complication. So that's my take on that point. There may be other views.
Thank you. Any other comments from the other panelists? This is, I think.
Okay. Well,
yes, please.
Let me answer to your question in a completely different way. Well, certainly data are extremely important for science, for the advancement of science. There's no doubt. And in fact, in order to get a meaningful set of data, you may have to design the experiment or observation. For example, in gravitational waves, you have to, before constructing your experiment, you have to estimate or calculate your noises, and also you have to calculate your expected signal. So before getting the scientific data, you have to really carefully design the experimental setup. And this is really a very important part of our scientific activity. Okay, that's all from me.
Thank you very much. Do we have time to?
Thank you.
Well, I think I've just been told that our time is pretty much up. So I think let's all thank the panel speakers for their time and thoughts. And thank you very much for your participation. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this plenary session. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce the speaker for this evening, Professor Aaron Ciechanover. Professor Ciechanover, requires very little introduction. You would have met him earlier this week in various sessions. And as many of you know, he's the Nobel laureate for the discovery of ubiquitination and protein degradation. And he's been still very active in science, as well as illuminating more about the protein homeostasis in cells, he's also very active in drug discovery. But more than that, he's also been a very strong proponent for science and how science should benefit mankind. And I think today's topic is really very much in that advocacy role that he's been playing for society, and particularly relevant for us today as we battle COVID-19, not only in Singapore but for the rest of the world to overcome this pandemic. So, without further ado, I'll hand the time over to Professor Ciechanover. Professor, please.
Thank you very much. It's a little bit strange that I don't see you and you can see me on the screen. I wish that this year, 2022, will bring the end of the pandemic, and next year we shall all be able to meet again physically, let it be in Singapore or any place else in the world. So I'm a physician by education and also a scientist. And as was mentioned by the moderator, I discovered the ubiquitin proteolytic system. It's a very important quality control system in the body of all organisms, including plants, and that is responsible for quality control of proteins. And many drugs have been developed based on our discovery, mostly for cancer, but many more are in the pipeline for other diseases. Ourselves are also busy in developing a drug against cancer, but I decided not to talk to you about it today. Tomorrow, we are going to have a small group meeting, so those of you who are interested in joining, it will be kind of a free exchange of questions and answers. I will be able to address more of our own work. What I'm going to talk to you today is about the pandemic, but again, I decided not to talk about the biological side or the medical side of the pandemic, not about the virus, not about the variants, not about the vaccine, but I decided to talk about some other issues which are very bothering, and that's bioethical issues. I have another topic which is more general about bioethical issues related to the revolution of personalized medicine, but on that we shall talk some other time. I want to concentrate today, because it's such a subject that bothers us all, about bioethical issues related to the pandemic. And our time is short, so we shall try just to talk in kind of headlines. And afterwards, we shall have another session immediately after my talk of about 15 or 20 minutes, where I shall be able to answer some of your questions. Just to give you a background, you see in the picture, it's my city, the city of Haifa. I was born here, lived here almost all my life, and working in the medical school of the Technion. You see on the right side, you can see the building, the white building, and on the left side in the big picture, you see it's sitting just on the sea. This is the medical school, beautiful view to the Mediterranean, and we are very proud of this beautiful city. Okay, so let's go to some ethical issues that are related to the corona. I listed 5 of them. These are my own list. It's not necessarily all of them. Other people might see things different. There are treatment priority, neglected subject, vaccination, skepticism about vaccination, anti-vaccination movement, and then the infodemic and inequality and discrimination. And as I said, we shall use the time left in order to talk about each of them briefly. So let's talk about treatment priorities. In Israel, we met it, and the issue was, of course, it was during the first wave when we had a lot of severely sick patients, but we had a limited number of teams of intensive care unit teams, limited number of respirators, and the issue is who should be put on the respirator and who should not be put on the respirator. If you think about it, it's kind of giving us the permission as medical teams to decide who will live and who will die. Luckily, in Israel, because it's a very modern country and we are acting very quickly, we didn't reach the point of saturation. Nowadays, with the Omicron pandemic, we are far away from it. The disease is relatively light. We have relatively few severe patients. We have a very sophisticated medical system in Israel. But at the first and second wave, we were saturated, almost saturated. And we were few cases away from deciding whom to sort out, whom not to give the opportunity to survive. So how do you do it? You do it according to age. So there might be old people that are in better shape than younger people. You decide according to other severe diseases that the patients are having, like heart diseases or cancer or dementia, brain diseases. You know, who we are to decide how long the patient has to live, and you know whether we have a permission to take his or her life from him and from the family. Well, but circumstances enforce us to decide, and we set a committee of many wise, clever people, clergymen, legal people, sociologists, psychologists, physicians, nurses, to decide about a set of criteria and to build a score. It's not dependent on one criterion like age, like one disease. It's made of many criteria and scoring of each criterion. And if you are reaching a certain number, means you cannot get the life-saving treatment. If you are not reaching it, it means you can get it. So you don't have the contract criteria. And luckily we didn't get there. But we were lucky. Other countries were not lucky. And you should ask yourself in your own countries. I don't know. Typically, when I'm running this meeting, the opening question is, of course, where are you from? And people are coming from different countries. They are coming from Indonesia, from India, from America, from more developed countries, from less developed countries. And I'm sure that in some of your countries, physicians and medical teams have faced this problem. Maybe they didn't discuss it, but they faced it. One of the countries that they faced it is, of course, Italy. And look, I will bring to you along my short talk just examples from the professional literature. I'm not making it up. So you see, this is taken from Nature, and it says Italian doctors, this was happening in Milan in the first or second wave. Italian doctors on coronavirus frontline face tough calls on whom to save. So you see, this was a practical question, not only in Italy. I can tell you that in Spain, I can tell you that in America, and I'm sure that more so in less developed countries. Another issue, the second one that I wanted to discuss with you is, of course, neglected subjects. You know, pandemic has affected all of us all over the world. And at the same time, we neglected other subjects. We neglected climate change, but mostly in our own medical system, we neglected other diseases. You can imagine, as related to the first issue, the treatment priorities, I'm working in a medical school, and the medical school has a huge hospital next to us. We have a big hospital of more than 1,200 beds. It's a very good comprehensive hospital. But the flooding with corona patients had to force us to close some of our departments. We closed some of the department of surgery, we closed oncology, we closed hematology, and we treated only urgent cases in those departments. The number of surgeries went down by 80%, the number of cancer treatment went down by almost 80%, and so on and so forth, in order to make space for corona patients. We converted many of our wards in the hospital, many of our departments, into corona departments. And many other patients did not have access to their routine treatments. You know, we caused a lot of damage by that. Who told us the treatment of corona has a priority over a treatment of heart patient, of a cancer patient, of a patient that needs a surgery? Who told us that we have not caused worsening of the situation, making it worse, of other patients by making space to corona patients? How can we decide which patients can still get treatment and which patients should not get the treatment that they deserve? right? It's not like the first priority, like the first subject we were talking about, treatment priority, which is life and death. But yes, it is about bettering or worsening the situation of patients with other diseases. I'm sure that we caused a lot of damage to other patients, a lot of harm to other patients, that their situation deteriorated. And you know, the same is for dealing with climate change. Climate change is behind our corner. Actually, it's not behind the corner, it's already in. So here you have kind of a cartoon that people are looking at the television about the news of COVID-19, but meanwhile, climate change is coming as a storm and threatens to drown them in the big disaster of climate change. So how we decide how to prioritize general subjects in the society. Think about the pandemic of hunger. You know, we didn't deal at all with the pandemic of hunger. Look at the right side on a paper of Nature. AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis are surging. Other diseases that are not being treated. People don't get immunization against tuberculosis. People don't get treatment for AIDS, for malaria. In less developed countries, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, their situation is worsening. Think about cancer research. Pandemic to delay cancer advances by nearly 18 months. Can you think that by a year and a half, we are postponing the development of other treatment for other diseases like cancer? Can you imagine how many people are going to die because new drugs, novel drugs, are making later by a year and a half to arrive at the market? So this is another issue that we have not solved. Vaccination. Vaccination is a big issue. I will not talk about all the problems of vaccination. We don't know a lot of vaccines that were developed in China, for example. We don't know a lot on vaccines that were developed in Russia. But this is not the issue about the type of the vaccine, whether it's a Sinopharm or Sinovac or Sputnik, the Russian. They are all working one way or another. The issue is the movement of anti-vaccination. And this is related also to the infodemic, to number 4, on which we'll talk. But let's talk about the United States. There has been huge movement against vaccination in the United States, which spread all over the world, including to my own country. In Israel, we are a very small country. We are about 9 million people, and about 1 million people are raising their voice that they are not going to be vaccinated. And let's read what's written on here. Trust in God, not vaccine. Look at the lower right side. No mandatory vaccination, no microchipping. People are afraid that instead of being injected with a vaccine, the government is injecting to them a microchip that can follow them, that can tell the government where they are. No tyranny, no fear, and so on and so forth. No vaccine. Look at here. This is a planned global power. Grab the messenger RNA. The messenger RNA vaccine will kill millions more than COVID. So the vaccine is going to kill people, not the disease. So what is the source of this anti-vaccination? There are two sources. One of them has to do with a medical institution themselves. Here you have an example of a physician, a British physician by Andrew Wakefield, who published, he's a doctor, and he published papers, a book, and then a paper, and then a book that is telling us that the vaccine against MMR, against measles, mumps, and rubella causes autism. So mothers to young children decided to stop their vaccination of the children against MMR, against the triple diseases of measles, mumps, and rubella. And many of them got the disease and died because they were afraid that the doctor said that it's causing autism. Of course, it was a lie. It was a misinformation. And it took years to revert it and to find out that the doctor fooled the world. We don't know why he did it. And you see it here. Another book came 10 years later, but meanwhile, hundreds of children got the disease and thousands of children got the disease, and many of them died. And you see here on the right side, again from Nature, the discredited doctor held by anti-vaccine movement. The anti-vaccine people are those that hailed him, that kind of promoted him, but it was a disaster. I can tell you another issue. There was in Japan, there was a rumor, again, a misinformation, that young girls that get vaccination against the human papillomavirus, which protects them from uterine cervical carcinoma, from cancer of the cervix of the uterus, the vaccination against it, which is extremely efficient, but the rumor told them, the misinformation told them that it causes some disorders in movement, that it will affect their legs and their hands, and they will have movement disorders. And the mothers stopped for several years to vaccinate their daughters against human papillomavirus. Within less than a decade, 25,000 Japanese women got cancer of the uterus, non-vaccinated. 6,000 of them are already dead. And I can tell you that at least another 6,000 are going to die until the government discovered that this was a lie and reinstated the vaccination plan. So rumors that are coming from the medical institutions are one reason why people are stopping vaccinating and why people are against it. But there is another issue. And the other issue is lack of trust in the government. And look at this. This was a poll that was running in the United States and asking people, this was before the vaccine, so it's more than a little bit a year old. It was at the end of, I would say, in 2020, before the first vaccine came to the market. And the question was, do you plan to get a corona vaccine when one is available? And look at the people that says yes, and look at the people that says no. Don't look at the other one, just the yes and the no. Look at the people age 60 and older, people that are old, that are a little bit afraid of the disease, that are a little bit wise, that they have experience in life. 67% yes, 12% said no. But look at the black people, with the black discriminated minority in the United States. 25 said yes, and 40 said no. Almost threefold the opposite from the age 60 and older. And the rest are in the middle. What is it about the black people? They don't trust the American government. And you know why? They are right. There is no reason for them to trust the American government and the American people. They have been discriminated based on their color for many years. But let's talk about a single case. And the single case is called the Tuskegee experiment, the Tuskegee study. American physicians who are responsible for our health decided to make an experiment and to take 400 black people who got syphilis in a village in a small city called Tuskegee, and not to treat them. You know, syphilis is a very easy disease to treat. It's a sexually transmitted disease by a bacteria called Treponema pallidum. And with simple antibiotic, once there is the first lesion, you can treat it. But once the disease advances, it climbs along the neurons, and it gets to the brain, and then people are suffering from very severe nervous diseases and dementia, and they are dying. They decided, the physicians, not to treat the patients, against the very swear that they swore when they graduated medical school, to help anybody, regardless of money, regardless of sex, regardless of religious, regardless of skin color, regardless of anything. we are obliged by swearing to treat anybody that need medical help. I remember very well myself swearing this oath. And this physician betrayed, let's don't use any other word, betrayed their swear, their oath, and decided to inject the patients with water, telling them that they are injecting them with the treatment in order to follow the natural evolvement of the disease. The experiment took 40 years, from 1932 to 1972. 200 of the patients out of the 400 died intentionally. I would say they were murdered. They did not die. They murdered by their physicians in order to satisfy a stupid curiosity of the physicians to see the natural development of the disease. The experiment was stopped because it was discovered by the New York Times and other media, and the American government and later on the President of the United States asked for excuse, for forgiveness from the Black community. So why should they trust the government? And therefore, now you should trust the government, because I think that governments want people not to get sick. But you have to think long term. When the government asks for our trust, the trust is being gained along many years of trustworthiness. The government cannot lie to you one evening and ask for your trust the next morning. That will never happen. So this is a big damage that happened to us now in the pandemic, that the Black people are still not trusting, and rightly so, the American government. So as I said, the anti-vaccine movement has two roots. Of course, people are believing in all kinds of stupidities. They don't understand the biology. They don't understand medicine. All in all, the vaccines are extremely safe, and they reflect major achievement in science. Scientists should be admired for this development, which took decades on decades. You know, the messenger RNA vaccine is based on knowledge that has been gained since the early 50s, since the discovery of DNA and then messenger RNA and the genetic code and so on and so forth. But again, you see that it's not only science that people don't understand, because they rely more on politicians, and politicians are kind of sitting in between the crowd, the people, and the scientists. And if you don't trust the politicians, certainly you don't trust the scientists. So this is another issue. There are other issues that are related to vaccines. For example, rich countries can vaccinate their people. Israel is regarded as a very rich country. I myself got 4 injections, the first 2, then the booster, then another booster. And we have enough vaccine for ourselves, but the issue is it right that we are not sharing our richness with less lucky countries like in Africa or in Southeast Asia that cannot afford buying the appropriate amount of vaccine necessary to vaccinate all the population. So there is inequality in the division of the vaccine between different countries. There is an issue of vaccination priority between different countries. So let's move to the other subject. And the other subject is infodemic. This is another disease, and I don't know which disease is worse, the disease of infodemic or COVID-19. Unfortunately, the social networks like Twitter and Facebook betrayed us as well. Instead of serving the purpose of benefiting and helping the society, in the name of democracy, in the name of freedom of speech, they let anybody talk. And people, you know, they are malicious people. They disseminated all kinds of information along this, using these social networks. They disseminated information about the damage of vaccine, about infertility and sterility, and about heart diseases that are very common where they are extremely rare, and so on and so forth, about drugs that do not have any beneficial effect, and so on and so forth. And the infodemic, the pandemic of information, is divided into disinformation and misinformation. I will not go into the difference between the two because of the shortage of time. But you know, in the social network, we are following basically stars. I am not sitting on any social network. You can trust me. I don't believe in this way of communication, and I think that it's unreliable and untrustworthy. And in my opinion, it's stupid. But famous people have their own followers, millions of followers. And think about two people. One of them was the past president of the United States that advertised different drugs. He has no clue about pharmacology. He has no clue about science, but nevertheless, he recommended hydroxychloroquine that works in treating early stage coronavirus. Of course, it turned out to be wrong, and so on and so forth. Why should the president of the biggest country in the world, of the most, not the biggest, the most developed country in the world, should deal with it? Why shouldn't he give the permission to his physicians and scientists to talk? And many people followed him. They don't know, they hear, they do. They don't have tools to judge, to think what is right and what is wrong. And think about Madonna. Madonna has millions of followers. She is really a star, a superstar. And she told us in her Facebook page that basically the coronavirus is a conspiracy theory, and if there is a vaccination, it's vaccination only for the rich people, for the people that can afford it, and not for the poor people, and just forget about corona, and so on and so forth. Why should she do it? Instead of serving the community, instead of promoting vaccination, instead of admitting that corona is a true disease. You know, by the way, I just read yesterday the death toll of corona. How many people died? Well, the official number is something between 5.5 to 6 million people. The real number is probably 20 million people. 20 million people, more than the people that died in World War II, were succumbing to corona, while people like Trump and Madonna deny that it all existing. Instead of walking into the hospitals and see how they collapse, they use the social networks in order to disseminate lies. So I have something to say about the social networks. They did not serve the society. And the last one is inequality and discrimination. You know, we are living in a very stressful society. And in a stressful society, any stress leads to rising of racism and discrimination and anti-gender feeling, and so on and so forth. Think about depression in Germany, in Europe, in the late 20s, which gave rise to the Nazi movement. Any change in the economy, any change in the health state, any major disaster brings from underneath the surface a very bad feeling that shakes the society. It just tells you that basically all our nice behavior is thin, very thin. It's breakable. Basically, our wild feelings, our animal senses are live behind a very thin layer of politeness, of being nice. And the pandemic of COVID was not different, and many racist feelings came up. You remember very well what happened in Minnesota when Chauvin, a policeman, a white policeman, really suffocated to death Floyd George, a black person, by pushing his knee against his neck and basically murdering him during a kind of a protest, which led to a counter protest in the United States, which called Black lives matter. It matters that black people, we live and we live in dignity. But this is outside the scientific and medical world. But inside the scientific and medical world, we are suffering from the same problem. And it's amazing because as scientists, we believe in facts, we believe in equality, we believe that people should be judged by merit, by their contribution, and not by their skin color, not by their gender, and not by their religion, but forget about it. We are all the same. And look, I tell you, I bring you something that was published in Cell and in Nature. In Cell, there was a leading article, editorial, science has a racism problem. Within science, we are discriminated women, we are discriminating black people, we are discriminating Hispanics, and so on and so forth. And on the right side, white senior academics still resist recognizing racism. So you see, we are exactly like the average people, like the average person in the street, prejudiced, discriminating, and it's awfully, awfully disappointing. But at the end of the day, let's look at science, because science is truly our co-pilot. Science is indifferent to what we are doing. Science is science. You know, the vaccination is either working or not working. The drug for cancer that we are developing will work or will not work. And it will be done by objective people all over the world that don't know us. So at the end of the day, we should really trust science, but we should also adapt to the rule of science. And the rules of science are humbleness and objectivity. We should judge each other, we should judge the facts just by merit, and we should leave all other considerations aside. And actually, more importantly, we should serve as an example to the society, as leaders that lead the society rather than being led by prejudice, by discrimination, and by racism. So thank you very much for your attention. I had a lot more to say, but we are limited by time, and we shall take questions now. So all the very best to you. Good luck to you wherever you are, and basically also good luck in your career wherever it is going to take you. And thank you again very much for your attention.
Yeah, Professor Ciechanover. And the questions have been coming in. I think everyone has been following your talk with enthusiasm. Thank you for the the very thorough overview of all the issues, but also the inspiring words at the end. There are a couple of questions related to how you personally responded to questions from the media, from people who are concerned about COVID-19 and to the SARS coronavirus when it first emerged in beginning of 2020, when the scientific information available was then lacking. How did you deal with uncertainties, and how should scientists respond to those kinds of questions when information was less reliable at that point in time?
Well, at the end of the day, the information came very quickly. Even the Chinese released the sequence of the virus, which allowed Moderna and Pfizer to develop the messenger RNA vaccine, and other companies to develop more traditional vaccines, which are based on either the attenuated virus or the purified spike protein. There was some hesitation, but I think that all in all, the scientific community has shown quite a mature approach. And the matter of the fact that less than a year from the breakout of the pandemic, I remember it well, I was in Singapore actually in January of 2020 in the GYSS meeting. Actually, I was in Singapore 6 weeks ago between the waves, and it was supposed to be now, but I was not diagnosed. I was diagnosed with like marginally positive, so I decided not to take the risk. I'm completely healthy and very fine. I remember it very well. So less than a year from the first breakout, which was, well, depends how you look at the cases, either January or of 2020 or December of 2019. December, I got my first shot. It's unheard of. The first shot after clinical trials, after development, 11 months for development of a drug, unheard of. I think that all in all, from all over the world, from China, across the world, the scientific community forgot about competition, forgot about ego, and did its job very well. We are now in a very different situation than we were 2 years ago.
Absolutely. And there are, on this issue of the rapid development of vaccine, that, as you say, we also had to combat a lot of misinformation on vaccines about how this is not safe because it was developed so quickly. So there's several questions related to how do we improve the trust between the public and scientists, right? Should we have more scientists and engineers in the government as politicians to advocate for science? Why is there? Then there's also a question on why some doctors and scientists are actually involved in anti-vaccine movement, and how do we deal with that?
Yeah, the second question is very difficult. I just cannot understand it. I brought one example of Andrew Wakefield, the pediatrician from Britain, from the UK, who published a lie that caused huge damage. Actually, he's a murderer. You think about it, there is no other way but to call him a murderer, a mass murderer. He didn't murder one kid, he murdered numerous of them. But it's hard to believe that you are studying in a medical school, you are studying in a university, you have an approach to scientific information, and nevertheless, you say the opposite. How can you do it? I mean, what is it all about? Well, I have no explanation to this. But let's go to the first part. I think that we need really to educate the public, and I think that scientists, including Nobel laureates, and I'm doing it a lot, should come to the media. We should not enclose ourselves in an ivory tower of our laboratories and trust the politicians or the journalists or the media people to explain. I think that we do have authority. I think that we do have influence, and prominent scientists, I'm not saying only Nobel laureates, should come to the medium and explain in simple words with simple drawings that the vaccine is working. It's not harmful at all. There is statistics. People are not, if people don't believe and they have their own opinion, and if you feel that you are moving in parallel lines and there is no way you can convince, then, what can you do? But I think that we should do any effort to put scientists in governments, to put scientists and technologists and engineers in different bodies that are shaping and carving policy, but mostly in the media. The media is extremely powerful. And I think also, and maybe people will not like me for that idea, but I couldn't care less about whether people like me or not. We should control in some way also the social networks. In the name of democracy, we cannot cause harm. We cannot kill people in the name of so-called freedom of speech. This is unheard of and unacceptable.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with that even more. There is a question on how serious are the COVID-19 pandemic ethical issues compared to those that arose from other pandemics or other epidemics in the past. What's special about COVID-19 that kind of separated from other outbreaks?
Well, I don't think that the magnitude of what happened with COVID-19 can be compared to anything else. Of course, if you're looking at the big pandemic at the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century, let's take the flu pandemic in 1918, there was no communication, no television, no flights, no airplanes, no nothing. People didn't know anything. The only thing that we can compare it is a little bit to SARS, maybe, a little bit to AIDS, maybe, but SARS luckily was kind of self-containing, and AIDS, we learned very quickly about how to behave and how to protect ourselves. Even the gay society, which I respect enormously, learned how to take cautious steps, precocious steps. So the magnitude was not the same. And also drugs were developed against AIDS, against other. So there is nothing to compare. But there will be additional pandemics. No doubt about it. We are pushing for it. They are all handmade, man-made. And I think that we should learn all the lessons from this one in order to get ready for the next one, including involvement of scientists in the media, including the use of the social networks, because the next one is behind the corner. So I think that this is the first one from which we can really learn a good lesson for the next one, which is sure to come.
Absolutely. Rachel Moses asked a very related question to what you've just said. And she asked if, one of the issues with science is that, or at least in this pandemic, is that the science was played out right in front of the public's eyes. So on one hand, with early information that came out, a few days later, there's a revision and a slightly evolved interpretation of the scientific data. So her question is really about how non-scientists can follow how the scientific understanding evolve as we get more and more data. So how do we keep the public from becoming confused by all these changes?
I'm not a magician, but I can tell you one thing. I can talk about the ubiquitin system, which I co-discovered, to kindergarten children. I can take children of 5 years old and explain them what we did. Not with biochemistry, not with nothing. I can explain them about irreversible changes that occur to protein. We can talk about how you fry an egg. You take an egg and you fry it, but you cannot take the egg back to become natural, and they understand it. So I think that with simple language, you can use illustrators to develop very simple drawings and explain it to anybody. Don't underestimate the understanding and the knowledge of people. Everything, even the most complicated one, is explainable. We just need some scientists and talented people and talented illustrators to bring it on the table. It is possible.
Yeah. So related to all that you've said, I mean, how should universities and graduate schools respond to the needs of society, right? So I'm just saying, like, for one thing, medical schools, graduate schools, no one trained us to speak to the public. No one tells us about how to communicate with lay people, right? We're trained to talk to other doctors. We're trained to talk to other scientists. How important is that for us, moving forward? That perhaps is there room for universities to now begin to think of, training scientists to also be advocates?
I think that yes, exactly. You are absolutely right. I think that the universities, they are changing their view these days. But what I think is that they see their role in a very narrow way. They look at their role as educating professional to the market. We have a medical school. We need every year to put 100 doctors in the market, and we don't care much more, or 100 engineers to the market. No, they should change their view. They should get involved with the community online. Students should be trained to talk to people, should be trained to talk to the communication, to the media, should be trained to think, I would say clearly, to express complicated idea in a simple manner. I think that the curriculum in the university should really change, so the university, along the educational path, should keep online communication with the community and the society. We are not only putting professional into the market in order to treat patients. We are putting into the market, we are educating people to live in the society. And living in the society means much more than your very narrow profession. It means getting involved in a much broader way. And I think that universities are paying attention now. We are not only professional schools. We are much more than that. But no doubt that this new role of the universities, about which we learned a lot during the pandemic, should be broadened and deepened in whole higher education institutions worldwide.
So we're coming to about 5 minutes before, or less than 5 minutes now before we end. Maybe a last few questions that we can tackle. And one of them is, related to how it takes time for us to communicate with the public and convince them that, some things are safe. Is there a role for mandatory vaccination?
Well, this is, I'm living in a so-called democracy. Israel is known, I would say it's a democracy with few dents. It's not perfect democracy. And I am, if you are not vaccinated, you are endangering other people, right? Which means that you are not much different than a drunken driver driving 250 kilometers an hour. So I'm against forced vaccination, but if you are not ready to be vaccinated, stay home. Don't endanger me. Take your food by order. It will be put next to your door. Don't get out. Don't endanger me. This is, I think, if you have an ideology, hold to it. And I bring you one example, the Witness of Jehovah. There is a section, a small section, that refuse getting blood. And they tell you as a surgeon, I am a surgeon by training, if you are operating on me and there is a need to transfuse me blood, let me die. Don't transfuse any blood to me from other people. These people are ready to die, to sacrifice their lives on their ideology. This is something that I respect. But if you want not to vaccinate yourself and at the same time you're asking for the same rights that I have, to go to the supermarket, to go to the theater, to go to the public, to go to school, you're endangering my life. You are endangering my life. You're endangering the life of the members of my family. Why should you do it? So if you are anti-vaxxer because of ideology, please quarantine yourself.
Thank you. And one final question. How do you think COVID-19 is going to play out? What will happen this year? Will pandemic come? What is the way we live change?
I'm not a public health expert, and I'm not an infectious diseases expert. I studied medicine, but many years ago, I'm not practicing medicine anymore. I think that with Omicron, we have some hope that so many people will be infected that there will be maybe something close to herd immunity and the virus will not find any host. And I think that with the Omicron also we learned that we can live with the disease side by side. In Israel, we are attenuating gradually all the quarantine rules. People are ready to get out after a quarantine of 5 days. It might be even shortened. Yesterday, the government changed it from 7 to 5 days. You need a simple test, a simple antigen home test. But basically what we should do, we should really trust one another. We cannot lie. We cannot cheat. The government actually relayed the responsibility that she took initially to the people. Again, as I said about the anti-vaxxers, we are responsible to one another as a society. And we should take this responsibility very seriously and live with it side by side. Like we live with flu. Every year we have a wave of flu that hits all countries all over the world. Maybe it will become kind of a seasonal disease. And don't forget also, we have not only vaccines, we have drugs. Pfizer and Merck and Novartis came with new drugs to attenuate the severity of symptoms. So we developed also anti-COVID-19 measures. So all in all, let's say I'm cautiously optimistic.
On that note, on a very optimistic note, thank you very much. I appreciate the time that you've taken to speak to us and to take all these answers. I hope to be able to see you in Singapore next year as well, or perhaps even sooner.
Me too.
Thank you very much.
All the best. Take good care of yourself. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.
Uh, Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to Professor Takaaki, Kajita, distinguished colleagues, members of the public, and everyone on this online platform. I'm Phil Chan, Deputy Head from the Physics Department of National University of Singapore, and will be your moderator for this session. I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished speaker this evening, Professor Takaaki and Kajita. And he is the 2015 Nobel laureate for physics, and both a distinguished university professor and the director of the Institute of Cosmic Ray at the University of Tokyo. He received his Doctor of Philosophy from Tokyo University in 1986 and studied under the eminent Japanese physicist, Professor Masatoshi Koshiba. For the past half a century, Japan played an important role, in fact, a leading role in neutrino physics. In 1980, Professor Koshiba pioneered the construction of the huge neutrino detector located underground in Haida in Gifu Prefecture. Professor Koshiba used this experiment to detect neutrinos from distant supernova explosion. In the process, became one of the founders of neutrino astronomy. The work led him to share the Nobel Prize in 2002 with Professor Raymond Davis and Professor Riccardo Giacconi for detecting neutrino oscillation. It was when Professor Koshiba was carrying out his Nobel Prize winning work, our guest speaker this evening, Professor Kajita, was still a physics student then, was inspired to work under the guidance of Koshiba. After Professor Kajita's doctorate degree, he joined the Institute of Cosmic Ray in Tokyo, playing a key role to show that the ratio of electron to muon neutrinos coming from opposite sides of the Earth is different. This significant finding meant that the neutrinos that were created when cosmic ray interact with nuclei in the upper atmosphere change the flavor, or sometimes known as oscillation, as they pass through the Earth and must therefore have a tiny mass. And as you know, Professor Kajita won the Nobel Prize for this together with Professor Artur McDonough, who led an experiment in Canada in the snow experiment. Professor Kajita is also a multi-talented physicist. In 2008, long before he won the Nobel Prize, he made a bold decision to switch research to gravitational wave detection. That same year, he became the director of Institute of Cosmic Ray Research and played a major role in getting funding for the KAGRA project. And KAGRA project is now an joined the international effort to hunt for gravitational waves. Recently, 2017, Professor Kajita was elected into the prestigious Science Council of Japan. SCJ's role is to make recommendations to the Japanese government and the society pertaining to science. And he was also nominated as the president for SCJ in 2020. Through SCJ, Professor Kajita hopes to communicate the important role of fundamental science to the public, which he believes is as important as doing science itself. He said in a recent Physics World interview, science has become so important for deciding the direction and the society and even the future of Earth. Physics is clearly one of the important parts of science. Without further ado, we would like to invite Professor Kajita, our distinguished speaker today, to share with us this evening. Okay, Professor Kajita. Okay.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Now, today I want to talk about neutrino oscillations, and let me share my slide. Okay, today I'm going to talk about our work on neutrinos, and in this page, you see a photo. This is the inside of Super Kamiokande. So today I'm going to talk about the neutrino studies in Super Kamiokande. Okay, this is the outline. First, I have a brief introduction on neutrinos. Then I want to discuss our early work in Kamiokande. Then I want to move on to the discovery of neutrino oscillations. And also I want to mention the importance of small neutrino mass. And I want to summarize this talk. Okay, what are neutrinos? Well, neutrinos are fundamental particles like electrons and quarks. And they are something like electrons without electric charge. And in fact, this has a significant consequence. Neutrinos can easily pass through even the Earth, but they can interact with matter very rarely. Therefore, we are able to study neutrinos. And neutrinos have, like the other particles, three types or three flavors, namely electron neutrinos, muon neutrinos, and tau neutrinos. And neutrinos have been assumed to have no mass. And we can detect them by this way. So we observe particles created by a neutrino interaction with a nucleus. Then, for example, if this nucleus is in water, then this particle emits Cherenkov photons, and therefore we observe these particles by detecting Cherenkov photons by photodetectors. Okay, now I want to move on to our early work. Well, I'm going to talk about the Kamiokande experiment. And in fact, the original motivation for the Kamiokande experiment was the search for proton decays. In the 70s, grand unified theories of elementary particles predicted that protons should decay with the lifetime of about 10 to 30 years. Well, certainly 10 to 30 years is a very long lifetime, but this can be detectable. Therefore, several proton decay experiments began in the early 80s, and one of them was the Kamiokande experiment. And here I show the sketch of the Kamiokande detector. It is a large underground water detector. It had a water tank of about 16 meters in diameter and 60 meters in height. And this tank contained 3,000 tons of very clean water. And also inside, we installed about 1,000 hot multiplier tubes to detect Cherenkov radiation. Well, certainly, if a proton decays, then 2 to 3 particles are emitted, and these particles radiate Cherenkov photons. Therefore, we'd like to observe these photons by these photodetectors. And this way, we wanted to observe proton decays. And of course, in order to observe proton decays, we have to construct the detector. And this photo was taken in the spring of 1983, when we constructed the Kamiokande detector. And this photo was taken at the entrance of the active mine. So we constructed the Kamiokande detector in active mine. And the construction work was something like that, like this. So we had to install hot multiplier tubes inside the Kamiokande tank. And in order to do so, we installed these plastic boats. Namely, we used these boats to install the photomultiplier tubes at a specific height. And if we finish one layer, then we raise the water level by 1 meter, then we start the next layer. So this way, we constructed the Kamiokande detector. And we started the experiment in July 1983. And of course, we wanted to observe proton decays. Unfortunately, we observed only background events. They are neutrino interactions. And these neutrinos are created in the atmosphere. Cosmic ray particles come into the atmosphere and interact with air nucleus. Then typically pions are created, and of course pions are unstable, therefore decay to a muon, then to electron. And during this decay chain, neutrinos are created. And these neutrinos, most of them simply pass through even the Earth, but some of them interact in the Kamiokande detector. And these are the most serious background to the search for proton decays. Therefore, we had to study these background events. And let me talk about our story around 1986. In 1986, we still tried to observe proton decays, but until that time, we had significant number of atomic neutrino background events. Therefore, we decided to develop new software to improve the proton decay analysis. Namely, we wanted to better separate the proton decay signal and the neutrino background. Anyway, we developed this new software, and as a test, the neutrino type was studied for the atomic neutrino events so far observed in Kamiokande. Then we found that the muon neutrino events, the number of muon neutrino events was much fewer than expected. And by the way, in this slide, in the right side, I show a typical muon neutrino event observed in Kamiokande. So this type of event was much fewer than expected. We thought that it's very likely that there were some mistakes somewhere in the data analysis. That means somewhere in the new software. So we started various studies to find out mistakes. Well, we worked hard. We worked for more than 1 year to find out mistakes. But we were unable to find any serious mistake. So after about 1 year of studies, we concluded that the muon neutrino deficit cannot be due to any major problem in the data analysis. So we thought that this might be the reality. So we decided to publish our data, and the essence of the publication is shown here. So we counted the number of muon neutrino events and compared with the expectation. And we found there's a significant deficit in the muon neutrino events. We also counted the electron neutrino events and compared with the simulation. And for the electron neutrino events, the data and the expectation agreed reasonably well. So that's all we discussed. Well, it was clear there's something strange going on. But at that time, the world community was not very well, world community was still skeptical about this data. And also, in addition, we had no clear idea what was the cause of the deficit. But anyway, I was most excited with the data. And I changed my research completely from the proton decay searches to neutrino studies to know what is happening in neutrinos. Well, clearly, with this data alone, we were unable to find out the cause of the deficit. There could be several possibilities. However, from the beginning, we have been thinking that maybe the mu neutrino deficit could be due to neutrino oscillations. But neutrino oscillation was predicted more than half a century ago by theorists Maki, Nakagawa, Sakata, and Pontecorvo. According to them, if neutrinos have mass, neutrinos change their type from one type to the other. For example, as shown in this figure, mu neutrino could oscillate to tau neutrinos. And the blue curve shows the probability that mu neutrino to remain mu neutrinos. And as you can see, at some point, this probability goes down. And at that time, the probability mu neutrino change to tau neutrino goes up. So this is the neutrino oscillations. And if this is happening, that data can be naturally explained. However, as I said, there were several other possibilities. So we wanted to distinguish neutrino oscillations from other possibilities. And for this, we thought this way. Well, these neutrinos are created in the atmosphere. Therefore, some of these neutrinos are created above the detector, say 10 to 20 kilometers above the detector. And these neutrinos come to the detector after traveling 10 to 20 kilometers. And probably, maybe, the flight length is not long enough for neutrinos to change their type. However, these neutrinos are also created in the other side of the Earth. And these neutrinos have to come to the detector after traveling long distances in the Earth. Typically, they have to travel, say, 10,000 kilometers. So these neutrinos have to travel long distances, therefore they may oscillate. So if we think this way, we should observe up versus down asymmetry of the atmospheric neutrino. And if this is observed, this can be the evidence for neutrino oscillations. Unfortunately, the 3,000-ton Kamiokande detector was not big enough to observe this kind of phenomena. So we needed a much larger detector, and that was Super Kamiokande. Now I'd like to move on to the discovery of neutrino oscillations in Super Kamiokande. Super Kamiokande is a larger version of the original Kamiokande detector. It is a 50,000-ton water Cherenkov detector. The diameter is about 40 meters and height is also about 40 meters. So compared with the original Kamiokande, the fiduciary mass that can be used for the physics analysis about 20 times larger. So with this detector, we can accumulate neutrino data substantially quicker compared with the Kamiokande case. And this is an international collaboration. At present, we have about 200 collaborators from 10 countries. And I'd like to show you this figure. This photo was taken when we constructed the Super Kamiokande detector. In fact, the year 1995, we worked in underground to construct the Super Kamiokande detector. Anyway, the construction work went well, and we started filling pure water into the Super Kamiokande detector in January 96. And this photo was taken at that time. And the neutrino event looks like this. This is a typical atmospheric mu-neutrino event observed in Super Kamiokande. So in Super Kamiokande, we observe about 10 neutrino events in a day. And many collaborators studied these events as a team. So after 2 years, we were able to report our major result at the Neutrino conference. And this is one of the slides we used at the conference. Well, certainly before this century, we didn't have PowerPoint. So we used the plastic film to show our result. And well, in fact, this is very important. In fact, this was a very important data. These shows the neutrino arrival direction distribution for electron-neutrino events and muon-neutrino events. Electrons are shown in the upper panel and muon-neutrinos are in the lower panel. And cosine theta 1 means downgoing neutrinos coming from above, and cosine theta minus 1 means upward going neutrinos coming from the other side of the Earth. Then these small black circles with error bars show the data, and the hatched histogram shows the Monte Carlo expectation without oscillations. And you can see for downgoing neutrinos, the data and the simulation agreed quite well. However, for upward going neutrinos, the data showed almost a factor of 2 deficit compared with the expectation. And this can be naturally explained if we assume mu to nu tau oscillations, namely muon-neutrinos created in the other side of the Earth have to travel long distance before arriving Super Kamiokande. And during this travel, the muon-neutrino change their type to tau neutrinos, and well, they have to change continuously their type. And therefore, when they arrived at the Super Kamiokande detector, the probability that muon-neutrino to remain as muon-neutrino is essentially 1/2. So this way, the neutrino community was convinced that neutrinos oscillate. And therefore, we knew that neutrinos have small mass. And of course, we reported this result at the conference for neutrino physicists, but something unexpected happened. The President Clinton at the United States gave a talk at MIT's 98 commencement. And well, this was about 30 minutes long. And during this talk, he mentioned our result. And let me read what he said. Just yesterday in Japan, physicists announced the discovery that tiny neutrinos have mass. Now, that may not mean much to most Americans, but it may change our most fundamental theories, from the nature of the smallest subatomic particles to how the universe itself works, and indeed how it expands. And of course, as the US president, he mentioned the contribution of the US physicist in Super Kamiokande. Then he continued, the larger issue is that these kinds of findings have implications that are not limited to the laboratory. They affect the whole of society, not only our economy, but the very view of life, our understanding of our relations with others, and our place in time. Clearly, this was very nice words to us, and I was very happy to hear this talk. Now, in the remaining time, I'd like to talk about the importance of the small neutrino mass. Well, you may ask why we are so excited with the neutrino mass. Well, certainly electrons have mass, quarks have mass. Therefore, in a sense, it is natural that neutrinos have mass. Why we are so excited? Well, certainly we are excited because neutrino mass are small. Let me show the neutrino mass. After more than 20 years of studies, we have a rather good idea on the neutrino mass themselves. And they are here. So clearly, neutrino mass are very small. And neutrino mass are approximately, or maybe more than 10 billion. That means 10 orders of magnitude smaller than the corresponding mass of quarks and charged leptons. 10 orders of magnitude smaller. And we believe this is the key to better understand elementary particles and the universe. So we are excited. Of course, if we understand why neutrino mass are so small, we could understand elementary particles better. But why universe is related? Well, in fact, we think neutrino mass could be related to the mystery of the universe. Well, here I show a photo of the far universe. There are many stars and galaxies, and we know that all these stars and galaxies are made of matter. We know there's no antimatter star or antimatter galaxy. Well, this seems to be so trivial. However, if we think about the history of the universe, we realize that this is not trivial. We know that the universe began with Big Bang. In the Big Bang universe, the temperature of the universe was extremely hot. And in this extremely hot universe, particles and antiparticles are always created simultaneously. Therefore, we naively expect there should have been equal number of particles and antiparticles in the Big Bang hot universe. Then, with the universe cooled down, these particles and antiparticles meet and annihilate. So, we naively expect there should be no matter particles in the present-day universe, no antimatter particles. However, of course, we know that there are matter particles. Why? Well, I think we understand. At the Big Bang universe, there was, say, 1 billion plus 1 matter particles. On the other hand, the number of antimatter particles was 1 billion. And 1 billion plus 1 and 1 billion are almost equal. Then, with the universe cooled down, these particles meet and annihilate, and therefore, at present, we have only 1 matter particle. So this way, we understand the mechanism. However, we do not understand why there was extra 1 in matter particles. Well, to be honest, we do not know the answer to this question. But many physicists think that neutrinos with very small mass might be the key to understand the big mystery of the matter in the universe. So, therefore, if this idea is correct, we understand the mystery of the universe. Therefore, we think we should study neutrinos more. And we'd like to know if the neutrinos are related to the origin of the matter in the universe. And to answer to this question, we'd like to observe if neutrino oscillation of neutrinos and those of antineutrinos are different. If we observe the difference, that could be the first step to understand the origin of the matter in the universe. However, in order to observe this effect, we need the next generation long baseline experiments with much higher performance neutrino detectors. And in fact, there are 2 large projects going on. One is in United States. This is called LBNF Dune. Another is the Hyperkamiokande project located in Japan. And I would like to briefly discuss this Hyperkamiokande project. Hyperkamiokande will be a still larger neutrino detector. It will be about 70 meters in diameter and 70 meters in height. The fiduciary volume that can be used for the physics analysis could be 8 times larger than Super Kamiokande. And because of this very large mass, we have many important research topics in neutrino physics and astrophysics. And this detector is under construction, and the experiment will start in 2027. Here, I show one photo. This is the excavation of the access tunnel to Hyperkamiokande. So in order to construct the Hyperkamiokande detector, we started from the excavation of the access tunnel. Anyway, this is really a very large scientific project. The Hyperkamiokande collaboration have about 500 members from 20 countries. So this is really going to be a very large global project. Okay, let me summarize. Atmospheric mu-neutrino deficit was observed unexpectedly by proton decay experiments. Subsequently, in 1998, Super Kamiokande discovered neutrino oscillations, which shows that neutrinos have mass. The discovery of non-zero neutrino mass opened a window to study physics beyond the standard model of particle physics. And neutrinos with small mass might also be the key to understand the fundamental questions of the universe. And finally, I feel that I was very fortunate. I had very good advisor, colleagues, and I was involved in very good projects. Finally, I want to say, if we work hard and if we are lucky, nature kindly tell us the secret of it. Okay, that's all from me. Thank you.
For your interesting talk and your quotations from the former president. Okay. Right now, we open to the floor for some questions. There's one question that just came in. Do you think that the observations of the cosmic neutrino background could provide evidence for heavy neutrinos in the early universe and in turn the seesaw effect?
Thank you very much for this question. First of all, I believe you mentioned about the 2 Kelvin cosmic neutrinos. First of all, if we are able to observe this cosmic background neutrinos, that could be really a breakthrough in science. We have, well, as far as I know, we have no idea how we can detect them. So it will be really exciting if you are able to observe cosmic background neutrinos.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Recently, it seems that stirred neutrinos may be ruled out by the mini-bone experiment. Could you share with us your thoughts on the evidence of stirred neutrinos or its possible role in the standard model?
Well, thank you. And actually, I'm very sorry. I'm not updated my knowledge. Well, as far as I know, the mini-bone 2021 paper still claim some excess. And well, maybe I'm not updated, but as far as I know, they still claim the excess. And therefore, in that sense, the stellar neutrino was not excluded at that time. But certainly, stellar neutrino is a very important topic, and I definitely want to see the future data. And I'd like to know the firm conclusion, either evidence or exclusion of stellar neutrinos.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Okay, we can have a couple of more questions. What are the detection rates of events with the hyper Chemicadae? Are we at the stage to do faster data analysis with huge event rates?
Oh, well, thank you. Well, certainly compared with super Kamiokande, event rate will be much higher. And well, actually, I do not remember exact number. I'm very sorry, but compared with the present super Kamiokande experiment, well, at present, super Kamiokande is exposed to the beam from JPAC, and this experiment is called T2K. And compared with the present T2K, the event rate will be about 25 times higher. And therefore, we have a reasonably higher event statistics compared with super Kamiokande.
Yeah, all right. One question. Due to oscillation, we now know that neutrinos have tiny mass. Would you like to comment on the possible mechanism on how neutrinos may acquire mass, unlike other fundamental particles which got their mass from the Higgs mechanism?
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, yes. This is a very important point. Other particles, electrons or quarks, they acquire mass by Higgs mechanism. But clearly, neutrino mass is extremely small. Therefore, we believe that the mechanism of the neutrino mass generation is different. And many people think that neutrino mass is generated by the mechanism called seesaw mechanism. And according to this mechanism or model,
Right.
there must be extremely heavy neutrino-like particle. And because of this extremely heavy mass, neutrino get a very small mass. I'm sorry, I cannot explain very well, but this kind of quantum effect, neutrino get the very small mass.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have time only for one more last question. We have, I think, a lot of young physicists and budding physicists in our midst and online. One last, perhaps a personal question. You are a man of many talents. You have moved to gravitational wave astronomy. What inspired you to do that?
Okay, thank you very much for this question. Well, I moved gravitational wave around 2008, but before 2008, I worked in neutrino physics for more than 20 years. And I thought that 20 years is really a long period. And I wanted to do something new and something exciting again. So I decided to change my research topic to gravitational waves.
Yeah. Yes, certainly exciting. Yeah. Okay, in the interest of time, let's thank the speaker for taking his time all the way from Japan and to be with us this evening. So once again, we thank the speaker.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for all of you to spend this evening with us, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
I'm pleased to welcome our first speaker of the session, Annie Marlene from EPFL Space Center. She'll be sharing her findings on digital design tools that she developed for simulating complex space mission scenarios like Apollo mission on Moon.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anne-Marlene Reedy. I'm a PhD student at the EPFL Space Center in Lausanne, in Switzerland. And first of all, I'm very happy to be here. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about my PhD thesis, which is in collaboration with the European Space Agency, and it's titled Connecting Space Logistics and Architecture, a Pattern Language for Robust Mission Design. So let's see more. So before I start, maybe just a little bit of context. Up until now, most space missions that have been what we call simple mode missions. These are satellites, rovers, space probes, so anything which is launched to its destination, lives there for a moment, and then is decommissioned and left there. So it does not have any sort of servicing. It just goes once. A couple of notable exceptions are space stations, the Hubble Space Telescope, or the Apollo missions, for example, which indeed have some sort of servicing or bringing back of human samples, for example. And so the important takeaway from this is that in the near future, we expect a lot more missions to be what we call complex mode missions. So these are missions that have servicing in situ, such as for refueling, bringing supplies, bringing humans, bringing back humans, doing some sort of repair. And those are also missions which can be interconnected between them. So we're going to see a lot more of these. And unfortunately, we don't know very well how to design these. So I'll illustrate this. So in 1961, US President Kennedy announced the goal of putting a man on the moon and bringing him back safely before the end of the decade. And 1 year later, the mission architecture had still not been decided. And without the architecture, it's not even possible to start working on the infrastructure or the technologies that will be needed for the mission itself. So what was the problem? The problem was that initially, the first idea, an instinctive idea, is to do an as simple as possible mission. So from the surface to the Earth, to the surface of the moon, and back. And the problem is that the mass that we find with this mission is actually too large. There's a big cost in mass in space, and it's just not possible to do a mission that's that heavy. If we look on the screen on the left side, we have only these, they're called direct missions that were considered. And if we look at the lower part of the left screen, we actually see that in terms of performance in mass and in mission success probability, we're still unfortunately quite far from the utopia point. And one engineer, John Houbolt, figured out that we need a completely different concept. What we need to do is to separate the spacecraft in lunar orbit and have only a small part land on the moon. And that saves a lot of mass on the moon, which in return saves a lot of the propellant mass on Earth, which makes up most of the mass of a space mission. And this actually reduces the mass by almost 50% at equal probability of success. On the lower part of the right screen, you can see that the selected mission, which does have this separation, is indeed a lot closer to the utopia point, so it performs a lot better. This idea is credited with having eventually enabled to perform this mission before the end of the decade, and also saving an estimated $180 billion to taxpayers, just anecdotally. So the important takeaway here is that we need to have a way to find which are the questions we need to ask to design effective complex space missions methodically. And so that's what we're trying to work on. So a solution may actually come from the field of architecture. So all also in the 1960s, there was an architect called Christopher Alexander, who was tasked with generating or designing 1,500 houses for modest income families in Lima, in Peru. And he quickly realized that a one solution fits all, fits no one. And it's not possible to do bespoke houses because it would exclude the target population in terms of costs. So he actually invented what's called pattern languages. And so for each possible need, he draw a diagram. And so you have different options that you could insert into the plan, and you would insert one or another based on what the family would indicate was their budget and what their needs were. And so a draftsman could, within assemble these parts together following a simple algorithm and generate a house that would match exactly the budget and the needs of these families. And so we got inspired from this concept, and we started working on a pattern language for space missions. And so we have a couple of elements like routing. So where are the materials going? Function, is it operational, non-operational? And is there any changes in mass? So mass entering or exiting the system. Won't go too much into details, but the takeaway here is that when combining these, what this generates is these architectural strategies such as pre-positioning material, using resources found in situ, remanufacturing, sharing resources. And these are all strategies that we know have the potential to reduce the mass of a mission. So also circular economy principles can help us choose which patterns to use preferentially, as we would try to use first those that reduce the mass needed, and then finally reuse, repair, and finally dispose, which we would try to avoid. And so finally, we try to recreate the Apollo case using these patterns. So what we see here is a couple of mission candidates that have been generated for the same objectives using the proposed pattern language. And the four at the top are actually the main options that were considered by the team, which can be shown with these patterns. Again, I won't go too much into detail, but each pattern is linked to inherent quality, and so the patterns can be used to very quickly generate estimates for mass and for risk, for example. So this can be done automatically depending on which pattern is or isn't in each candidate. And what we find here is that indeed the solution with here shown in green with the separation of the spacecraft in lunar orbit does perform best. It is the closest on this chart to the utopia point. And what we also find is that when using the diagrams, we can actually very quickly recreate the configuration for the Saturn V and Apollo launch vehicle. So this means that these patterns also are inherently linked to the infrastructure that will be needed. And so here, this is actually the diagram for the mission that has been chosen. What we see is that these questions here shown in green, these Hubble types of questions, they do appear naturally in the use or non-use of certain patterns. That means that if we generate the missions using these patterns, it is equivalent to asking these Hubble types of questions methodically. And so in conclusion, we can generate these mission concepts. They do give us somewhat accurate estimates, and they do naturally raise these Hubble types of questions. So considering these findings, we're currently developing a digital tool that could be used for a larger variety of mission objectives that we think will be used in the future. the expected outcomes of this is to help generate effective candidates quickly, to identify high-value candidates quite easily, and this also extends to the infrastructure that might be needed. And furthermore, to help with the communication and visualization. These diagrams can be easily compared between each other, and this helps support transparent decision-making and communication with very different experts. And so there we go. So thank you very much for your attention. Again, my name is Anne-Marlene Reedy. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to send me an email. So thank you very much. Hello, everyone.
Thanks, Anne-Marlene, for that insightful talk. We're ready for the questions. So if there are any questions, please put them in Q&A session. And to start off with, perhaps like I could ask a quick one for you. So we realize that the generative models for architecture are quite getting popular these days, and this the architectural space has like inspired you a lot to like design your simulations. We're just wondering, like, would you be looking into more machine learning techniques to like generate these patterns automatically and like give you a really good solution? Like, any thoughts on that you would like to share?
So about the machine learning, yes, eventually. Certainly a little bit later, probably it's a very good idea to use machine learning. This being said, right now, the problem is actually being able to somehow transform these questions into something that a computer could understand or even have a solution. And that's why the first step is really to translate these into patterns, which then we can apply further methods.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, it seems like you have a great vocabulary there for space missions. So it's a really niche area for sure to explore. There's a question on chat which is asking about what kind of spatial missions can this method be applied to?
Okay, so they're largely almost all of the past missions that have been made, with a couple of exceptions that you probably know of, are what are called simple mode missions. They're also sometimes called sortie-style missions. So think about satellites, for example, or space probes, which are sent out into a destination, then they operate there and they're left there. And essentially, these all have the same mission concept. But in the future, what we're going to have is more and more of these quite complex mode missions, which use on-orbit servicing. So that can be in situ refueling, that can be in situ repairs, inspections, resupplying, for example. It can be assemblies, disassemblies, any type of construction. And we're going to have a lot more of these missions. And these are exactly the ones we don't really know how to design the mission concept for. So that would typically be the population of missions this would be applicable to.
Wow, that really sounds like a wide range and a very helpful tool to have for sure. There's also two more questions, in fact, and we just quickly take that. Could you comment on whether the SpaceX uses the same approach?
In what sense?
The company SpaceX perhaps uses the same approach in terms of like simulating various patterns in advance, I guess.
So I wouldn't be aware that they would. I'm actually not aware of anyone using pattern languages.
I would assume that this is quite novel, I guess.
This is a very new problem.
Yes, I would assume.
So as far as I know, I don't think so. Certainly, I didn't get inspired from SpaceX specifically for this method. then what they eventually do is always behind the scenes is difficult to say for sure.
Sounds good. All right, there's one more question that we have time for, and that's how did you generate all patterns? Can you explain more in the application in the short future?
Those are two questions, correctly?
Yes, two-part questions.
Okay.
Yes. So let's take the first one. So how do you generate all the patterns, perhaps? Yeah.
Okay. So so what I'd have to say is I'm currently still relatively in the beginning of my PhD. So what I've shown today is more of a first idea of a pattern language, but this still needs to be consolidated and tested over time. But as of right now, what I did basically is I listed all of the solutions that I know from architecture and I have already used during architecture projects. And I've been just listing these out and trying to draw them also and just finding which concepts reappear. So there are a couple of concepts such as direction, location, usefulness of a flow of material which come up. And then I've drawn a lot. And actually, at some point, I realized that a lot of these patterns are actually just very simply combinations of the different directions, the different usefulnesses of the different streams of material flow. And so that's one way these can be generated. But I certainly expect this to still be improved a little bit over time. And can you just say the second question again?
Yes. So the second question was, I actually, can you explain more in the applications in the short future? I think you already covered that. So, but yeah, if you have more comments, yeah, we have less than 1 minute. Yes.
One of the things, maybe a big picture application that this is thought for is really to be used as the first tool. So you input mission objectives, and then you kind of use this to pick out not necessarily one in particular, but at least a couple of concepts that seem quite interesting for you to then investigate. And what we typically do is, for example, we do concurrent engineering sessions. There are quite a lot of tools which already have been developed to estimate costs, to do calculations for astrodynamics, for example. And we can all use these, but up until now, they mostly rely on a known concept, which is where this tool could really complement existing methods.
Awesome. That's really insightful. Thanks so much once again for your time and answering all those questions. I think that's most of the time we had for Q&A, and we move on to the next speaker. All right.
Okay, I'll just say a big thank you for having me on this platform. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Please welcome Daniel de Sensi from ETH Zurich, who will be presenting his work on congestion mitigation in large distributed system for high-performance computing.
Hello, I am Daniele from ETH Zurich, and today I will present my research work about optimization techniques for high-performance interconnection networks. So my research lies in the fields of large-scale distributed systems, computing systems, and you can see one of those in this picture here. So these are systems that are basically large computers made of many different computers or servers. In this figure here, you can imagine each of these green lights being one of these computers or servers. And you have hundreds of thousands of them in one single room, and these computers are connected between each other to solve some scientific problems. And they're used for many different reasons. For example, they are extensively used to perform weather and climate modeling simulations, for example, to predict where and when a hurricane is going to strike. But recently, they've also been used, for example, to help researchers find a vaccine for COVID-19. And actually, you also use them in an indirect way in your everyday life. So every time that, for example, you type a search on your web browser, your research goes through one of these systems that will look up into billions of web pages trying to find what you're looking for. So these are key computing systems that we use in one way or another in our everyday life. And to understand how these systems work, let's consider, for example, this use case where they're used for performing weather and climate modeling simulations. So in this kind of applications, you have basically a map of the world or of one region of the world, and this map is split in multiple parts, and then you have one server working on each of these parts. So each of these servers try to simulate what's going on that area of the world. But what you might have is that in some cases, this server needs to communicate to progress with the simulation. So this server here on the top right, for example, might have some data to exchange with this other server to understand how the article is moving from one side to another. And to perform this kind of data exchange to progress the computation, these servers need to be connected together with what is called an interconnection network. So that in this case is denoted in green. This interconnection network is made by links that are these green lines, and by these other devices that are called switches that basically move data from one side to another. And what I do in my research is to optimize this interconnection network and try to make it as fast as possible so that data is exchanged at a faster rate. I'll try to be very generic in this presentation, but if you have any question, please, you can ask me later. So let's focus just on these four servers here, and let's suppose that they need to exchange some data between each other. So data is basically wrapped inside what is called packet. A packet is basically a chunk of information that needs to be transmitted, and we denote this packet with these orange boxes here. So now what happens is that, okay, let's suppose that this server must send some data to this server. They select a path on the network, so a set of links that connect the source to the destination, and they start sending the data on these links. And then let's suppose that this one on the top right needs to send something else to the one on the bottom left. They also start sending the data. But as you can see here, now the data moves slower because both of these connections goes through the same link in the network. So because this is a physical resource and it is shared by these two connections, data moves at a slower rate. And so this is one of the problems that you might have in this kind of systems. So what is typically done? So we call this situation here as a situation of congestion because you have multiple pieces of data going through the same physical devices. What it is usually done in this case is that someone starts sending the data, and then before this server here sends its own data, it observes what is going on the network, and it observes that there is congestion on this link, and it decides to take a different path. So that in this way, the two connections goes onto these joint paths, and both of them can transfer data at full speed without interfering with each other. But doing so introduces some complications. So, for example, what often happens is that this one starts sending the data, this one realizes that there is congestion and decides to take a different path, but in the meanwhile, this congestion disappears. So now we have this data moving on a longer path, even if there is no congestion anymore on the shorter one. And this might be, we actually studied this and we realized that this is a very recurrent problem and a very relevant problem in many existing applications and many existing networks. So what we have done is basically to find ways to have the right trade-off between how sensitive we are to the congestion we observe, so that we avoid such kind of situations. And we applied these techniques on many different applications, reaching up a performance improvement up to 2x. And we validated this approach on real systems. So at that time, it was the most powerful supercomputer in Europe, and over many different real applications, including weather and climate modeling, molecular dynamics simulations, computational fluid dynamics, and many more. Another related problem is about data aggregation. So we have many cases where you have two servers and you want to aggregate two or more servers and you want to aggregate together the data coming from these servers. So the data reaches the same server. The server does some computation on this data and creates some new piece of data that then need to be distributed to both of them. And what we can do to improve the performance of this operation. So this is a very common operation, for example, in machine learning, when you train a model to, for example, to translate languages or to identify objects in pictures and so on and so forth. So this is a very common operation. What we can do instead is to let these network devices do some computation. So instead of sending the data from one server to another, both servers send the data to the same network switch. And this intermediate device here does the computation, obtains the new results, and distributes the results to both servers. And it has been shown that this can improve the performance of such kind of operations. But the question here is how this device is made. So what's actually inside this network switch? So these are devices that, as I was mentioning at the beginning, are designed to move data around. And if we have to make some computation there, then we need to design some new hardware. And this is exactly what we did. And we validated this hardware on some real use cases, showing up to a 2x reduction in the time spent for this application in the communication. And we validated this on an application, on a machine learning application, identifying objects in pictures. So identifying whether there is a cat in a picture, a car, or something else. And of course, we are moving forward with this research. There are other research directions we are exploring. So for example, if you consider the two examples I just made, so in one case, we say that we want to send the data where there is less congestion. So we want to have a lot of freedom in where we send our data to avoid congested area of the network. But in the other case, we need to we say that we want to process the data in specific points of the network where we want to aggregate this data. And these two requirements are conflicting between each other, because if you want to aggregate these two pieces of data together, we might want to aggregate them here, here, or here, but we have to decide this before. And this goes against what we would like to do when we want to avoid congestion, because in that case, we want to send the data wherever the network is less congested. And so we are working in such a way that we can somewhat combine and find better techniques to satisfy both requirements. Another problem we are analyzing is about data reordering. So in this example, this server sends first the orange packet and then the blue one. But what happens is that if they take different paths on the network, they might arrive at the destination in a different order. So in this case, the destination receives first the blue one and then the orange one, but this is a problem for many different applications. So there are applications where packets might arrive at the destination in the same order they were transmitted. And this, again, goes in conflict with the requirement that we want to send the data wherever we want. And we are working to address these issues. And the last one is about network security. So in many cases, data is encrypted. So actually, I would say most cases data is encrypted. So in these cases, if the switch in the network must process this data, then this is a problem, because the switch might not have the decryption key to unlock this data and process the data content. So this is also something we are working in. We are working on right now. So this was a very general overview of my research. If you have any questions, please, you are welcome to ask. I would like to acknowledge Professor Thorsten Offe, that have been my supervisor at ETH Zurich, and all the people I've been lucky to work with in our lab. Thank you. Hello.
Hi, thank you so much, Daniela, for that insightful talk. And we are here for the question answer session. I'm just quickly going to check on the live session if there are any questions yet. But if not, I would start off with one question. I was wondering, like, you've taken inspiration from the road networks to mitigate congestion in like supercomputing resources. So I was just wondering if you could give a bit more insights on like how was the computation cost and like how much time, computing time, did it take to come up with an optimal solution, because these are like quite complex systems that we are looking at here.
Yeah. So of course, like in this case, we can't hope to have some kind of centralized solution. So as it happens, for example, in road networks. So like, for example, if you use some kind of navigator, typically you would have the status of all the roads on the network, and it will try to find an optimal path. But in this case, since we are working on a much smaller time scale, so here we are talking about nanoseconds or microseconds, such solutions will not be very feasible. So each switch or also the endpoint must take decision only based on the local information that they have. And this means that the time required to process this data is much smaller, because you only have the data about the host or the switch is directly attached to you. And at the same time, this means that the accuracy is lower. So we are just taking decisions based on local information. So this is faster to do, but it's also more, it's not that accurate as a decision taken on with a global view of the network. So of course, these are heuristics, and we are happy if we can somewhat match more or less closely the ideal performance, but we at the moment we are not able to get that close.
Right. Yeah, that's great. I mean, near optimality also in such cases is quite useful. So that's really nice to have. There's a question on chat which says, I have not understood what tools you use to solve these problems. Is it rather mathematical, logics, or something else?
Yeah, so this, again, so even in this case, we could use some kind of complex graph theory approach to solve the problem in an optimal way. But again, we don't have the information about all the links in the network. So eventually these are heuristics. So in some sense, basically what each of these switches see is just the occupancy of the queues of that switch. And based on that, basically you have to apply some heuristic to, for example, to check if the gradients of the queue size is increasing or not, so to understand whether things are getting worse, and then if you have to route the packet somewhere else. So there is no, let's say, strong theoretical graph algorithms behind that, just because we don't have the view of the entire graph, but just of a small part of the network. So these are mostly heuristics. So yeah.
All right, there's one more question we have time for. Says really interesting talk in the examples where a switch is doing some computational analysis. Would it not be more efficient to have instead a dedicated node that does the computation?
That's a very good question. So the main issue here is that if you have a node, so for example, if you buy a server somewhere, or just usually you will have one network port. Like these switches have like 64 or 128 network ports. So just the rate that they can inject and process, it's much higher. So this is the main reason why. And the other reason is that if you do this with an actual node, you will need to move the computation from the network to the CPU, and then to get and the data from the RAM and back and forth. And this will introduce a latency which is too high. While these switches have some kind of dedicated architecture that are designed for have all this data movement done in a much efficient way. So this is the reason why having an actual node inside the network would be much less performing than doing this on a switch.
Right, great. We might have one more time for one more quick question. Perhaps, like, I was wondering, like, is there any contextual information that you could use to improvise on your heuristics that are being applied? Like, is there any application-specific context that might help you get better heuristics in this case?
Yeah, so there are some info, and actually we are exploiting that. So there are some information that the application can provide. So for example, how large is the size of the data that you have to transfer? Because in this way, like if you know that you have to transfer a very large message, for example, you can pay a little bit more overhead to find an optimal path at the beginning, and then like being more safe during the transfer. While if you have to transfer, for example, small data messages, then it's probably just worth to send the data wherever you want, because otherwise that overhead will be much higher than the gain that you will get by finding a better solution. So yes, this is one type of information that the application can provide to drive better decisions in the network.
Awesome. Great. Thanks so much for your time, Daniela. We'll go
Thank you
on
for
to the
having me
next.
here.
Thank you. We'll go
Thank
to the
you.
next speaker now. Take care. Our last speaker for the session is Moritz Flascher from ETH Zurich, and he'll be presenting his work on automatic model selection and calibration for studying the macroscopic behavior of different materials under different mechanical loads.
Hello, my name is Moritz Flascher. I'm a PhD student at the Computational Mechanics group at ETH Zurich. And today I would like to talk about how to discover constitutive laws in computational solid mechanics. The general objective in computational solid mechanics is to simulate the behavior of solid bodies under external loading. To do so, one typically solves boundary value problems. And one very important ingredient to such boundary value problems is the materials characteristic constitutive law, which describes the stress-strain relation in the material. The constitutive law is typically associated with a lot of uncertainties. As for different materials, one has to choose different constitutive laws, and the choice is not always clear. Therefore, the goal of our project is to discover constitutive laws from data. And this task is particularly challenging as the stress-strain relation of the material might be very complex and even path-dependent. The constitutive law has to further fulfill physical requirements, such as, for example, being thermodynamically consistent. And a further challenge is that we have limited access to stress data from experimental observations. Before I talk about our method, I would like to talk about data-driven constitutive modeling in general. So the classical approach of constitutive modeling is to choose a material model with a small number of parameters and calibrate those parameters based on some given data. The advantage of this classical approach is that one obtains very simple models. However, due to the assumptions that we make on the material model, we introduce some modeling errors, which leads to a bad fitting accuracy in some cases. And for this reason, in recent years, machine learning-based methods became more and more popular in constitutive modeling, such as, for example, surrogating material models with neural networks, or bypassing the formulation of material models altogether and running forward problems that are directly informed by the data. The advantage of such approaches is that we have a high flexibility in describing the material behavior, and we do not introduce any modeling errors. However, the disadvantages are that first, a lot of stress-strain data pairs are typically required for the state-of-the-art machine learning methods, which makes these methods supervised. And second, the methods typically have a black box type nature, and it's very difficult to physically interpret those material models. And for these reasons, we proposed a method that we named Euclid, standing for Efficient Unsupervised Constitutive Law Identification and Discovery. And the objective of Euclid is to run a deformation experiment of a given material and to measure the full field displacements, for example, by applying digital image correlation, and to further measure the reaction forces. And based on these data, to find constitutive laws as closed-form mathematical expressions. The key features of this method are that we don't want to assume any stress data to be known within the bulk material. And further, we want to find constitutive laws as closed-form mathematical expressions, which enables a physical interpretability of the discovered material model. Our first application was on hyperelastic strain energy densities, and our second application was for plastically deforming material behavior. In hyperelasticity, we typically assume that there is no dissipation when the material is deformed. However, the material may deform under very large deformations. The hyperelastic material behavior is characterized by the material's characteristic strain energy density function. And we here assume that the strain energy density function can be expressed as a linear combination of so-called strain features, which are nonlinear functions of the strain invariance, and so-called material parameters. And the idea here is to choose a very large catalog of features such that a large variety of different material behaviors can be described. And the goal is now not only to calculate the unknown material parameters, but also to select which features are really important to describe the material behavior. To do so, we make use of the balance of linear momentum, which works as a linear constraint on the material parameter space. And in particular, we minimize the internal forces at the free nodes in our test domain, as well as the differences between the global reaction force and the sum of internal forces at the boundary. If we would just minimize these two terms, we would obtain a dense solution vector theta, which would result in a very complex material model. And therefore, we additionally introduce a sparsity regularization term to our minimization problem, which promotes sparse solution vectors and hence simple material models. Finally, I would like to show some results for the case of hyperelasticity. Here I am showing the strain energy density functions of some true material models and the strain energy density functions that we discovered by applying our method. And we can see that there is a good agreement in the mathematical expressions for the true and discovered strain energy density functions. And we can also see when we plot the strain energy densities that there is a good agreement between the true and discovered strain energy densities. In the case of plastically deforming materials, we cannot anymore assume that there is no dissipation. In plasticity, the material deforms plastically after reaching some stress level. This material behavior is characterized by the material's characteristic yield function f, which indicates after which stress level the plastic deformation occurs. And if we assume isotropic homogeneous material behavior, the yield function can be expressed as a function of three principal stress invariants. And if we further assume pressure and sensitivity and apply a coordinate transformation to the principal stress space, the yield function can be expressed as a function of only two stress invariants. And the goal is now to use the data to discover these yield functions. The literature reports a variety of different yield surface shapes. However, we do not want to assume any specific shape a priori, but we want the algorithm to find out the shape. And therefore, we introduce a Fourier expansion of the yield surface such that we can describe arbitrarily shaped yield surfaces. And again, the goal is not only to calculate the unknown parameters in our ansatz, but also to select which modes in this Fourier expansion are really important to describe the data. Here, I would also like to show some results. Here we can see Euclid applied to simulated data with artificial noise, and we can see that in many cases, we can discover the true mathematical form of the yield function. And if we also compare the yield surface plots for different noise levels, we can see that the true and discovered yield surfaces are in good agreement. Finally, I would like to summarize. Euclid does not use any stress data, which is an advantage as this is typically not available from experiments. And it finds constitutive laws as concise mathematical expressions. And we have applied it so far to cases of hyperelasticity and elastoplasticity. In the future, we would like to work on the robustness to noise such that it can be also used in experimental settings. And we would like to generalize the formulation of the model library such that more different material behaviors are included. If you are interested, we are uploading all our codes and data to our project website. With this, I'm at the end of the presentation, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much for that talk. We're ready for Q&A session now. And to start off with, I think it's really useful to know that you can actually simulate the stress for different materials. I was wondering, like, for your initial validation process, how many different materials did you test this with? And what were some of the challenges that perhaps you can highlight?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So the first experiments were purely based on artificially generated data. So the project is quite new, so we are focusing on artificial data that we have generated through finite element simulations. And we are now currently working on the experimental validation of the method. And here we have to consider different materials, of course, and we have to be careful with the choice of the model library. That is all the models that we consider in our assumptions. So if the true material behavior is not part of the search space, we might have problems in deriving the material model, and then we have to increase the feature library. But yes, for now, the experimental validation is open, but the first results on simple tensile tests were quite promising.
Awesome, that's great. There are a lot of interesting questions coming up, so I'll just go with those. The first one is, do you see this method or its modification can be extended to computational fluid mechanics in the future?
Yes, say it's definitely possible. The question is in which regime you want to find constitutive models. For example, if the constitutive models are linear in any case, then this method does not make so much sense. But if you have some complicated fluid behavior, for example, some viscous fluids or something like this, I think this method could be applied very well in this field.
Thanks so much for that. Related one is, I wonder whether your method can be applied for non-homogeneous materials as well.
Yes, the question is there on what assumptions we make. For example, if we take full field measurements of some heterogeneous material, we could, for example, assume that there are two materials inside, and then we could try to find two material models and minimize the same cost functions as we did in the previous approach. I think that would be also possible.
Awesome, thanks so much. One last question says, great talk. For the finite element analysis, how do you choose your mesh to reduce computational cost and especially around edges?
So here we didn't do any computational cost optimization. We have an in-house finite element code, and we have meshed with like high enough degrees of freedom, and the accuracy is quite well, and the run times did not exceed, for example, a day or something like this. So the computational costs were not that high in this two-dimensional examples, of course.
All right, that sounds great. That's most of the questions we have. There's one more, but I think this is for the last speaker. The data you take can be transformed into graph or networks. I think this is for the last speaker. Yeah, so that's most of it. I was just also curious to know if these can be applied to any other domains that you might be potentially thinking of other than, fluid mechanics and in understanding the solid stress details. So are there any other areas or domains that you think this can be potentially applied to?
Originally, this sparse regression approach was not applied in solid mechanics, but in dynamics. But here the problem is a little bit more simpler because we have labeled data pairs there. We can learn a one-to-one relation between data pairs. But here really the problem was that we don't have stress and strain data pairs, but we only have the strain in the bulk material and the stresses at the boundary. So here we used this method, which was already known in the dynamics community, but we applied it to solid mechanics, and we solved the issue of the lack of data.
Awesome. That sounds quite interesting transition. Thanks so much again for your time. And with that, we also end this session here, and we'll hand over back to the main agenda. Thank you so much. Thanks to all the speakers.
Thank you.